Chapter 7. Alba. Alba stood at the back of the airy, spacious room, with its arched ceiling and graceful, rising coils of seats stair-stepped like leaves on a climbing vine, and watched as the aliens, the Yibo they called themselves, moved through their odd morning rituals, one of them chanting a sentence in their language, and the others repeating it back. It was something like a call and response in an Orthodox ceremony back on Colorida, although the light streaming through the windows, the spare, minimalist furniture, and the stylized greenery surrounding them, spilling over pots and draped from the ceilings, couldn't have formed more of a contrast with the heavy stone walls of the Orthodox churches, the ancient holographic projections glowing against the mysteries altars, and the stylized star maps drawn out on the ceilings, surfaces darkened with centuries of brazier smoke, the half-holy, half-claustrophobic feeling that had gripped uneasily at her chest since her first hazy memories from childhood. But here, in the light-drenched room, she found her mind wandering, just as it had in the Orthodox ceremonies, the ritual chanting forming a backdrop for her uneasy thoughts. These aliens had been in contact with humans. That much was clear. How or why, she had no idea. But Istve hadn't been the only one who had noted the chilling lack of living humans besides themselves among their Yibo hosts. She took a deep breath, forcing back the fear and panic that insinuated itself into her every thought. They were here now, and despite the near disaster at their first meeting, since then the Yibo had been more than solicitous, caring for the injured, providing food and shelter for the ragged band of survivors. But there was a bright thread of unease running through every interaction. If the Yibo were familiar with humans, why had they tried to kill them at their first meeting? Had it been a simple misunderstanding? Or were the Yibo on unfriendly terms with whatever humans they'd encountered in the past? And if so, why had they suddenly decided to treat Alba and the others with such deference? Today, she was meeting with the Yibo ambassador, who spoke the humans' common dialect. The Yibo had told them that the ambassador and various select others could speak the human tongue on account of an expensive and therefore rare universal translator they'd developed. But Alba had seen no sign that the ability had anything to do with a technological device. Her mind jerked back to the present as the last of the Yibo diplomatic aides chanted the call of their call and response, and the others answered, finishing with a sort of shout. The circle of lemur-like aliens dissolved into a chattering, milling group for a moment, and another group of Yibo, servants of some sort, it appeared, stepped through, bearing trays of a steaming drink poured into vessels that resembled miniature pitchers. The Yibo took their drinks, still chattering, and the servants paused, then came to stand before Alba and Josip, their eyes downcast, holding out the tray. Alba hesitated, but a glance at the ambassador showed he was watching her, his eyes sharp. She took a cup with a brusque nod of thanks, and Josip took one as well. She hesitated, then brought it to her lips, sniffing the steam rising from it. It had a sharp, clean smell, not unpleasant, similar, perhaps, to the bush tea people drank in the Rim Mountains. "It is nothing dangerous," the Yibo ambassador said, his tone amused. He'd maneuvered his way through the crowd to stand beside them. "It's simply our morning drink. Not an intoxicant or anything of the sort. A mild stimulant at best." She nodded and sipped delicately at her cup. The aftertaste was a touch bitter, but not unpleasant. "You have eaten this morning, I hope?" The Yibo man, at least he'd introduced himself with male pronouns, so Alba assumed he was male, asked. "Ah, that is excellent. Seat yourselves, please, and I'll ask the younger ones to take their morning libations elsewhere. I am desperate to hear your story." He called something to the other Yibo, and reluctantly the chattering group dispersed, leaving, finally, Alba, Josip, the Yibo ambassador, and a small handful of nervous-looking aides. "Now," said the ambassador, seating himself gracefully on one of the rising tiers of seats across from the stools. The Yibo seemed to assume that humans preferred. "I am Harach. I have been asked by Kachik, our head of government, to represent the Yibo in our negotiations, as I am able to speak your language." The name from his lips wasn't exactly Harach, but that was the closest sound Alba's mind could translate. He leaned forward a little. I am devastated by the tragedy that brought you here. Let me first tell you our regret for what you have been through. Alba closed her eyes, glass shard fragments of memory enough to suck the breath from her lungs. The claustrophobic press of terrified humanity bumping and shoving into her, ready to trample her and the injured Filiu under their feet in their blind, helpless panic. A woman's face turned to bloody ruin as a soldier's pulse gun went off, point blank. The terrified mass of people pushing for the escape shuttles. The glittering, expanding cloud of wreckage, ship parts and bodies mingled and cast out into the frozen void of space, to drift forever in the icy nothing. Her breath was coming too quickly, and to her horror, she found there was a tear tracing its way down her cheek. Herrick made a sound of distress. I'm truly sorry for bringing that to your memory. Please, allow me to offer my sorrow for your loss. Alba took a deep breath, trying to push the images from her mind. It was harder than it should have been. She'd slept poorly the previous night, and the night before that in the jungle hardly bore considering. And when she was tired, the horror the memories dredged up was almost too much to push back. Thank you for your kind words, she managed at last. Herrick tipped his head to the side in a gesture she'd learned meant acknowledgement. Of course. Now, I understand you had come here to negotiate. Is that correct? But perhaps let me reassure you first. We were distraught at the portal failing, and we have people working to restore it as soon as possible. I expect it to be done soon, perhaps 20 days. But in the meantime, please, tell me your purpose in coming here, and perhaps we can create some good from this tragedy. At the very least, it has been a great pleasure to find another species that is sapient, I think, is your word. We wish very much to have excellent relations with your people upon the portal reopening, and I believe an alliance would be mutually beneficial. His face was pleasant, and his words everything Alba had hoped for. But he was lying to her. The ball Aran had found, with its human maker's mark, sat heavy in her small reticule. We are your first contact with other sapient species? She asked at last. With technology to create a portal like you have, I would have imagined otherwise. And we are lucky indeed that your technology was able to translate our language so easily. Herrick gave a close-lipped smile of amusement. It appeared these aliens viewed showing one's teeth as more a threat than a gesture of friendship, and tipped his head again. Of course. We have various dialects in our system, and this makes it easier. The implant is difficult and expensive to program, so only a few of us have it, but it's enough that we can get by, and while you are not the only sapient species we've discovered, we have found they are rare. I see, said Alba. And what were your relations with these other sapient species? The Yibo made an amused humming. It was over a century ago, before my time, but my understanding is they were aggressive, and so my predecessors simply decided to close the portal so as not to allow them through. He twitched his tail in a gesture Alba had come to recognize as the equivalent of a shrug. We are more wary of newcomers now, and so it is a delight to hear from you that your intentions are nothing but peaceful. Despite the misunderstanding with your pet, land devil, was it? She'd been certain the aliens did not understand human sarcasm, but there was a note in Herrick's voice that made her look at him more closely. She paused a moment. Herrick, she said at last, I understand you are wary of newcomers, and with some cause, but I believe and always have that negotiations are best carried out with as much frankness as possible between the two parties. I regret the unfortunate misunderstanding when our people first met yours. I'm not certain you were informed, but the incident you referenced came about when the Yibo who found us pulled out 6 of our group in what appeared to be an attempt to shoot them. Our scientists stepped in front of the others to prevent this, and it was only when the Yibo attempted to put their hands on him that his animal attacked. Herrick watched her for a moment. His eyes were hooded, but there appeared to be a hint of unease in his posture. I was not informed of this, he said at last. If it is true, I will ensure the perpetrator is punished. Alba gave a dismissive shake of her head. "It is not my intention to ask for a liter of blood in exchange for our injuries," she said. "I simply wish this negotiation to proceed on the terms that will lead to the highest chance of success. And that, I believe, is a mutual understanding of the underlying factors." She paused a moment. "I understand our presence here is perhaps unexpected, but certainly it must not have been a complete surprise, considering the greeting you sent us through the portal." Herrick frowned. "The greeting we sent?" Alba exchanged a quick glance with Josip, who had been listening to their exchange quietly. When she caught his eye, she saw the small crease of concern between his eyebrows. "The container you sent through, filled with samples from your system," she said, turning back to the Yibo ambassador. If she hadn't been watching his expression as closely as she was, she may have missed the quick shudder of something, unease, perhaps, or possibly fear. "Ah, of course, we were not certain it had arrived at its destination." His face smoothed over, quickly enough that had she not been watching, she might have assumed nothing was wrong. But the tip of his tail, draped delicately over his arm, twitched slightly, and there was a tension in his posture that had not been there before. He was hiding something. She managed to keep the close-lipped smile on her face. "The item you sent contained objects of interest to our scientific community," she continued pleasantly. "Some of our world's best scientists accompanied us on our mission in the hope that they could speak with your scientists and perhaps exchange knowledge. I understand that with circumstances as they are, this is not the most pressing matter, but at the least, our sharing of scientific knowledge could act as a token of our mutual goodwill while we negotiate." Aran was correct. Finding the cure for the defect was important. But that wasn't the reason she'd asked. Her mention of the box had made the Yibo ambassador deeply nervous, and Aran, she knew, would find out everything he could about that box, or die trying, if it held even the slightest chance of keeping Istvay alive. The thought sent a twinge of guilt through her, but she pushed it resolutely aside. Herrick watched her for a moment longer, then tipped his head in agreement. "I'm certain we could equip someone with our translation program to act as interpreter. Give me the evening to work out the logistics." "You are too kind," Alba murmured. "It is no difficulty," Herrick said, although the tension in his posture said otherwise. "The sharing of scientific knowledge must be a priority among all sapient species, if we wish to peacefully interact." He shifted in his seat. "And now that we have, as you said, a common understanding of your history and ours, with respect to our meeting, let us—" Alba leaned forward slightly. "With all due respect, Herrick," she said quietly, "I think perhaps we do not yet have a full mutual understanding. We are trapped here at the moment, although I am gratified by your assurances that your people are working on rectifying that situation. However, if we are to proceed with our negotiations, I must be frank with you. My people are not entirely powerless. We have technology which, while different from yours, is highly valuable, and the contributions we could add to any alliance or negotiated settlement are not insubstantial." She paused for just a moment, just long enough to let him hear the threat she did not utter. "With that in mind," she said, reaching into her reticule, "I had hoped that you would explain to me when you last interacted with humans." She pulled the ball out of her reticule, the maker's mark clearly visible. For a moment, the room was entirely silent. Even the aides had stiffened, glancing around as if they wished to be anywhere other than here. At last, Herrick picked up the ball with his long, delicate fingers. There was tension in every muscle of his body as he turned it over and over. "I'm afraid you are mistaken," he said at last, laying the ball down on the table. "We have never met humans before now." He was watching her, his eyes never leaving hers. She frowned. She could feel the tension in her own muscles, the tightness of a headache at the base of her skull. "Herrick," she said, lowering her voice, "if you are at odds with this group of humans, perhaps there is something we could do to broker peaceful relations, but we must be honest with one another for this negotiation to have a chance of success." For a long time, Herrick was silent. The tip of his tail was twitching nervously, but his expression remained a polite mask. At last, his mouth lifted into a small smile, but Alba noticed that this time just the tips of his sharp incisors were visible between his lips. "I assure you, Alba, you are mistaken. You are the first humans we have encountered." His eyes flicked quickly from side to side, then returned to her. "I am devastated to disappoint you, but I believe this topic will be of no use to any of us. Now, would you like to return to our earlier discussion?" After her decades on the council, Alba was used to long days of negotiations. But by the time she and Josip were escorted back to the diplomatic quarters, uncomfortably full after the lavish meal they'd been served, Alba was bone-weary. When they reached their rooms, she sank down onto one of the low stools and let her shoulders droop for just a moment before she straightened. Josip sat as well, and she could see, under his friendly smile, the same core-deep exhaustion that she felt. "What do we do now, madam?" he asked quietly. She took a deep breath. "We cannot negotiate with them in good faith if they refuse to be honest. And their dishonesty does not bode well for us, I'm afraid." She paused. "I don't understand. If they have hostile intentions, why bother with this farce? For all I wish it was not the case, we are currently all but helpless. And if they intend to make some agreement or alliance with us, why lie so blatantly?" "I don't know," said Josip, his voice weary, "but I agree that it does not bode well. According to Herrick, for as much as his word is worth, we have 20 days to figure it out." And then there was a pounding on the door, and her head jerked up in surprise. "Josip!" someone was shouting, their voice harsh with panic. "Madam Chief Justice, you need to get out here, right now!" She exchanged a look with Josip and pushed herself to her feet. When they reached the rotunda outside, the human survivors were milling about in panicked confusion. "Alba!" said Istvay, striding over to her. Their face was grimmer than she'd seen it in a long time. "One of the crew was shot!" "What?" she snapped, panic lurching in her stomach. "What happened?" "They said he'd wandered outside, and one of the alien guards saw him and panicked," said Aran quietly. He was staring at the ground, like he usually did, but his jaw was tight, and he was stroking his murder beast absently. But he was unarmed. Judging from what we've seen, I doubt the guard saw a threat. I suspect they just saw he was far enough away from Ani that she wouldn't be able to stop him." "And have the guards tried to come in here? Threaten anyone else?" asked Josip. Istvay shook their head. "Not as far as we know. They were nothing but apologetic. But apologetic won't bring him back." "I'll send for the ambassador immediately," Alba snapped, but there was something tight and sick in her stomach. "Inez, please find me an interpreter at once." Something about her presence and her authoritative tone seemed to calm the crew somewhat, and for that, she could only be grateful. But it meant, of course, that she couldn't allow the cold fear slithering through her to show in her face, or her posture. She took a deep breath and imagined herself standing in front of the council. She had plenty of experience with high-stakes negotiations, but she was not accustomed to the consequences of her negotiations being enacted so suddenly or so permanently. "Ambassador Alba." She turned to see one of the Yibo standing at the door to the room. She drew herself up and strode over. "Yes, I would like you to inform your ambassador, Harok." "I have come from Harok," said the Yibo. "He has asked me to inform you that he has heard of what happened and deeply regrets it. He has told me to tell you he will look into it personally, and—" the interpreter hesitated a moment. "And he asked me to please tell you that Kachik as well conveys his regrets, and hopes with all his soul that such awkward questions as came up in your conversation with Harok today not delay your negotiations. He said it would be devastating to him should such misunderstandings breed more fear between the Yibo and yourselves, and potentially lead to more incidents." Alba stared at the interpreter for a long moment, her heart pounding. It did not take an experienced diplomat to hear the threat in the message. She had asked the wrong questions today, and in retaliation, the Yibo had ordered someone killed. Whatever the Yibo were hiding in regard to their prior interaction with humans, they had no wish to open the matter for discussion. She took a deep breath. 20 days before the portal reopened. If they survived that long. Chapter 8. Savina. Savina. Savina glanced up quickly. Joska had moved to stand beside her, and the woman's voice was low. Are you going to be all right out there? Savina paused for a moment, nonplussed, then, with an effort, pasted on her brightest smile. As you always say, this is my forte. The look on Joska's face told Savina the woman wasn't fooled by her bravado, but she only nodded. Good luck, then. Savina refrained from looking after her as the woman turned away. It wasn't like Joska actually cared about her. She'd stolen the woman's ship and gotten all of them stranded here. It was absurd to imagine Joska's concern was for Savina's well-being. Given the right excuse, and the woman's pretended kindness would melt more quickly than a late spring snowfall in the southern rim mountains. Are you ready, humans? The words had a harsh, scornful tone to them, and Savina turned. The alien speaking to her was smaller than the mob boss, but not by much. A young male, she understood. The dark fur around his eyes was an unusual light brown, his tunic the dull greens and grays that seemed to be the gang's trademark colors. She hadn't spent long enough around the aliens to know their body language well, but she could sense the arrogance rolling off this one in waves. She turned her most charming smile onto him. Of course. Benny and I are ready whenever you are. She enjoyed, for a moment, the flicker of uncertainty in his expression at her smile, and then she let it drop and widened her eyes. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot. Humans smile to be friendly, I wasn't thinking. He grunted, but it was clear that she unnerved him, which meant he wasn't quite as stupid as he looked. Let's go then, he growled, and she began a nod, then caught herself and tipped her head to one side to indicate agreement. He grunted again, calling out something in that stupid chattering language the aliens had, and they started out the door. The streets outside were as hot and muggy as they'd been the day before, when Savina and her companions had been dragged here blindfolded. No need for blindfolds now. Joska, Rafel, and Nicola were back at the gang's headquarters, hostages in fact, if not in name. Benny came up beside Savina as she walked. The aliens gave me a scan of the building where they think their target will have taken shelter, and my link gave me a verbal diagram, they said quietly. I've marked up the exits and entrances for you, and calculated which ones are most likely to be used for defense and which for escape. I'm sending it through now. A moment later, something flashed in the corner of Savina's left eye. She blinked twice to bring up the retinal screen and studied the translucent diagram as she walked. It was a small building, but multiple stories, which always made things more difficult. Do you have a plan for keeping them on one floor? She asked, blinking again to banish the image. Yes, said Benny. We'll send someone in to lock down the upper floors. There's a type of chemical bomb that should get them to shut everything down themselves. Not bad, said Savina, pulling up the diagram again and studying it carefully. We'll just have to make sure that it's not enough to cause an evacuation. We'll have people in place beforehand, said Benny. We should be able to do it without causing panic, but just in case, we'll have people at the exits. Good. Savina paused a moment. Thanks, Benny, she added quietly. She wasn't talking about only the job, and Benny probably knew it, but they just gave a quick nod and kept walking. Savina watched them, worry growing in her chest. She'd never seen Benny so quiet as they'd been the last few days. Not that she could blame them, it had been a lot for anyone, but she and Benny had been through so much together. Much as she tried to protect her sibling, she and Benny had been through plenty of crap. And she'd never seen it affect Benny like this. She'd fix it all, eventually. Somehow, she'd find a way to fix all of this, get herself and Benny and Nicolau away from these aliens, and back through the portal, kill Alba, and kill that government agent. For a moment, her traitorous brain flashed her first view of Reka Soler across her memory. Her muscular back and shoulders, her figure, the curves of her body. She shoved the thought away. The point was, she'd find a way to get them safe. Now they had Nicola with them. Maybe they didn't even need to go back to the compound. Maybe they could find another place to hide, just the three of them. The thought sent an unexpected ache through her chest. She'd never let herself think about her own freedom. She couldn't. She couldn't let on, even to herself, how badly she wanted to be away from the compound. To be free. It would have put Nicola in danger. And she and Benny had both agreed that was something they'd never do. They'd let him live his own life, happy and free, out in a world that hadn't yet learned to hate him. Of course, that was hardly a consideration anymore. As much as she'd tried to protect him, in the end, it hadn't mattered. He'd lost everything because of her. No, because of that stupid Chief Justice and her stupidly attractive attack dog, Reka Soler. Savina smiled to herself, her fists clenched. She'd get away from these aliens. She'd find a way. And then she'd kill Alba and Reka. It really shouldn't be difficult. "We're almost there," said the young male, falling back beside Savina and Benny. He was watching the two of them with open hostility. Savina gave him her most innocent smile. "Good. Now, I'll go in. You'll do whatever Benny tells you to. Once I take out the target, your people can come in afterwards to sweep up the stragglers." The alien returned her smile with one of his own, showing his pointed incisors. It was clearly not meant as a conciliatory gesture. "Explain to me why I should take orders from you," he said, the words taking on a sing-song tone. "You do the job, or we kill your friends. That's the bargain." Savina blinked at him in innocent confusion, and he hesitated just for a moment. And in that moment, Savina stepped past his defenses and slammed her wrist up, knocking the gun from his fingers with one hand, while with her other, she slapped the electric trank she'd palmed earlier against his shoulder. He froze as the current coursed through him, his eyes wide with shock. Savina pulled out a long knife and tickled it under his chin. The other aliens were beginning to turn, having realized suddenly that something had gone wrong. Savina smiled at them. "If any of you takes so much as one step towards me, or even pretends to go for your weapon, I'll give this idiot a brand new smile," she said. She had no idea if they understood her words, but she was certain her gesture was unmistakable. They hung back, and Savina turned back to her captive. "Rach is your name, isn't it?" she purred. "Well, Rach, I could slit your throat from ear to ear right here in the street. I could leave you to bleed out, and the interesting thing about an electric trank is your body would just stay standing because your muscles would be too tight to release. I've done it before. Takes a little longer for anyone to realize you're dead. I could do that if I wanted to, and not one of your friends would be in time to stop me. But I won't this time. You asked me why you're going to take orders from me. Because you want me to do the job, and this is how I'm doing it. You have your hostages. You have me under control. But don't ever make the mistake of thinking that means you've drawn my fangs, you bastard." She bent and picked up the alien's gun, turning it over in her fingers. "I'm going to take the electric trank off you, but if you so much as think a threat at me, or Benny, or any of my friends, I will kill you. Do you understand?" She paused, then gave a small, amused laugh. "Oh, silly me. You can't answer, can you? Because you can't move." She stepped in closer. Fear burned in his eyes as she brought up her knife, and for a moment she stood there, basking in his terror. Then, with a quick motion, she reached forward and tapped the electric trank from his shoulder with the tip of the blade. The alien's body jerked as he regained control of his muscles. He turned shakily to glare at Savina, but there was terror behind his belligerence now, and he spat a word she didn't recognize. She tucked it away in the back of her mind. People said things when they were angry, things they didn't want you to know. But now wasn't the time to worry about it. "Benny," asked Savina, "why don't you tell them where you want them to position themselves?" The aliens didn't protest again, especially after Savina handed the confiscated weapon to Benny and instructed her sibling to use it at the earliest sign of insubordination. Then, satisfied Benny had things under control, Savina stuck her knife back into its sheath, retrieved the electric trank, and took a deep breath, smoothing back her hair with her hand. The fact that she was a human would cause some interest in the streets, according to the mob boss, but not too much confusion. Apparently humans weren't completely unknown in the system. She'd been tempted to find out more, but in the end it didn't matter. What mattered was getting away from the aliens, killing Reka, getting the portal open, and killing Alba. Not necessarily in that order. She widened her eyes and put on her most innocent expression as she stepped out of the alley, no smiles. She didn't want to frighten anyone, and pulled open the door to the small, seedy drinking place their target frequented. A dozen pairs of alien eyes turned towards her as she entered, and she blinked at them in helpless bewilderment. Are you Kiritz?" she asked, pointing towards a squat alien in the corner. The alien, who was staring at her more in calculation than surprise, said something in a curt tone, and two of his people moved around the edges of the room to flank her. Just as she'd hoped. She took a faltering step forward and tried again, pointing at him and saying his name in a questioning tone. He was watching her with a predatory stare, and for just a moment, Savina felt a shiver travel up her spine. Nicolau was right. None of them had any idea how these aliens saw humans, as an oddity or a threat or a meal. He said something in his own language, and she took another couple of steps closer, as if trying desperately to understand his words. She was quite close now, maybe 2 meters away. He'd never have let her get that close if she didn't look so innocent and helpless, and it was the last mistake he'd make unless you believed in an afterlife. She crossed the remaining space too quickly for anyone to react. Then her knife flashed out, sharp enough that it hardly caught on the thick knot of muscle and artery and trachea. Blood sprayed across the room, and the aliens shouted in alarm, going for their weapons. Savina had her pulse pistol out in her free hand, and she fired off shots in rapid succession. 2 more aliens dropped before any of them were able to free their weapons. She caught the hint of movement to her right and spun, dragging the lifeless body of her target in front of her. He vaporized at the shot, the limp blood and flesh of him glowing briefly, then dissolving. She yanked out her knife and grabbed another of the aliens, one who hadn't had the sense to step far enough out of the way, and pulled him around in front of her, her blade sliding through his ribcage to find his heart. It was lucky, she mused as his body twitched and stilled, that the alien's anatomy was similar enough to that of humans that her usual techniques still worked. Another shot, and her second shield dissolved in her hands. "Benny! Send in the others!" Savina hissed, and dropped to the floor just in time to miss another bolt. She rolled under the table and aimed her pulse pistol at the shooter, and he went down with a high-pitched scream of agony. And then the doors burst open, and Rachel's people flooded in, weapons drawn. It took less than a minute to finish off the rest of the tavern's inhabitants, a brutal, efficient bloodbath that left disturbingly few bodies behind. Savina shivered. Whatever those weapons were made of, and whatever they did, they were more than anyone in the Joias System had ever dreamed of. When it was over, they piled the bodies in a heap, and one of the aliens aimed their weapon, firing until the pile had dissolved into ash and fragments. Aside from the blood smeared across the floor and spattered along the walls, you'd hardly know there'd been a fight. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes for a moment. Violence didn't frighten her. She wouldn't have lasted long in this profession if it did, but there was something about the way the bodies were simply gone, dissolved as if they'd never existed. Rach stepped up close to her. "You did your job," he said coldly. "Good, but don't make the mistake of thinking that makes you irreplaceable." She smiled at him, showing her teeth, and blinked innocently when he flinched back. He hissed the word he'd said earlier, and she watched him thoughtfully as he turned on his heel, gesturing her to follow as they started back for the safe house. She stepped up beside one of the other aliens as they walked. The alien turned, her posture uneasy. "What is this?" Savina asked, whispering the word in the alien's ear. The alien started, turning to her with an expression of terror, and made a quick, sharp gesture as if to ward off evil, babbling something incomprehensible in the alien tongue. "What?" asked Savina, pasting on her most innocent expression. "I don't know your language. I just heard someone say the word, and I wondered what it meant." The alien shuddered and turned away. Savina watched her as they walked. If there was something out there that these aliens feared, so much they'd spit it at her as an epithet when she tried to kill them. So much so that the mention of it made them wary. Well, that was certainly something she could use. She just needed a little information and a little time. Chapter 9. Iran. Iran stared at the group of aliens who, he'd been told, were scientists. They stared back at him. He shifted uncomfortably and cleared his throat. Ani gave a soft, low growl, and he reached up to stroke the tentacle that was draped down across his chest and gently push aside another which had crept over his chin. Ani had a tendency to get clingy when she was nervous. The Yibo scientists were still staring at him, although he noticed some had stepped slightly back at Ani's sounds of discontent. He cleared his throat again. Don't worry, she's very friendly. The interpreter, who had edged inconspicuously away to position herself on the side opposite Ani, as far out of reach as possible, while still being able to hear Iran's words, addressed herself to the scientists, presumably repeating his reassurances. They did not appear to reassure anyone. Iran cleared his throat again. Damn it, he was rubbish at this. Why the hell hadn't he let Istve come instead? Of course. He bit back a sigh. Because Istve was losing their damn mind right now. They determined in their bull-headed way that their number one mission was getting the portal back open, and they weren't going to contemplate anything else until that happened. If Istve had come, this entire enterprise would boil down to them asking the scientists, in tones of ever-increasing irritation, what the hell they had to do to get it through the Yibo's damn heads that the Yibo needed to reopen the portal immediately. The fact that in this instance Istve might actually be worse at this than he was did not, however, change the fact that Iran was rubbish at this. There was a box you sent through the portal, he said finally. There were some samples inside. Plants, voice samples, a blood sample. The interpreter was watching him, and he could see from her posture, if not from her face, that this was not what she'd been expecting him to say. But she tipped her head in acquiescence and turned to the scientists, speaking rapidly in their language. Iran had spent enough time observing animals that he was used to watching for the most minuscule reactions, not expressions exactly, but the way muscles tensed, posture shifted, eyes widened. Animals didn't lie. They told you, through their starts and shudders and growls, exactly what they were thinking and exactly what they were going to do. It seemed these aliens, from what Istve had told him, were as adept at lying as humans were. But he could see, from their small, subtle shifts as the translator spoke, that whatever she was saying made them deeply uneasy. At last, one of the scientists stepped forward and spoke a rapid sentence to the interpreter. The interpreter tipped her head to one side in acknowledgement and turned back to Iran. He says he's very happy to answer questions about the box, but since it was prepared with a great deal of care and has given you a good deal of information on our system, while they have had access to nothing at all from your planet, he would take it as a gesture of goodwill if they could ask you questions first. Iran frowned. But if they weren't going to talk, he wasn't exactly in the position to make them. He sighed, started to nod, caught himself, and tipped his head to one side. You can tell them I'm happy to answer some questions if we can talk about the contents of the box afterwards. The interpreter conveyed that, then waited as the alien scientist asked something, gesturing to Ani. He would like to know what that animal you keep on your shoulder is. He wishes to know if it is a common practice to keep such animals as pets on your planet. Iran glanced guiltily at Ani. Her species is the great, venomous, tree-dwelling, tentacled land devil. She's not native to our main planet, so they're not exactly a common pet, but she's very well behaved. Generally speaking, he amended. The interpreter conveyed this, and the scientist cocked his head at Iran, his eyebrows raised in question. Iran sighed. She, is native to an uninhabited planet a little ways away from Colorida, he continued reluctantly. With any luck, they wouldn't ask the next question. They asked the next question. And is there a reason this planet is uninhabited? The interpreter repeated. Aran sighed. They... He shifted slightly. If land devils are threatened, they can become mildly aggressive. He could see by the looks in the alien's eyes as the interpreter repeated his words that they weren't going to be satisfied with the explanation. They're venomous, he said at last, and, also poisonous, and they can inject you with digestive fluids, which will essentially melt your insides, and they can fly with their skin flaps. They're quite fast, actually, and they spit acid, which I guess you already know, and, they're impervious to most weapons, including radiation. I think when we first came to the Joias System, the humans tried to, destroy the planet with a nuclear weapon after the first group of settlers encountered the land devils. The land devils seemed to eat the radiation, so it didn't exactly work out, and they didn't dare try anything else. He was stroking Ani unconsciously, and as the interpreter repeated his words, he could see the looks of growing horror on the faces of the alien scientists. But that was before we realized how peaceful they were, generally, he added hastily. As long as we leave them alone and don't go onto their planet, there's absolutely no reason why they would show any sort of hostility. The scientist was speaking rapidly to the interpreter. He did not appear comforted by Aran's words. He would like to know why you've chosen to bring this creature with you. If the only way to halt their aggression is to entirely abandon any planet that they inhabit. Ani had sensed Aran's discomfort and was growling a little more threateningly now, the pouches under her eyes starting to puff out. Aran stroked her comfortingly. We generally don't. Ani's just... She's my pet. I raised her from an egg. She's very well behaved and almost entirely harmless. You've removed her venom, then? The scientist asked cautiously, through the interpreter. Aran stared at him, shocked out of his awkwardness. What? No, of course not. I'd never do something like that. He rubbed Ani's tentacle reassuringly. That's her only form of defense. Well, one of her only forms of defense. He realized belatedly that perhaps a less emphatic response might have been more reassuring, but she's never killed anyone. Besides, the interpreter let the sentence dangle. Aran shifted again. Well, I mean, not very often, and it was always provoked, so... From the looks on the faces in front of him, his explanations were not actually helping the situation. There were a few moments of uncomfortable silence. At last, one of the scientists asked, cautiously, through the interpreter, "This land devil, then, she is the most dangerous creature in your system, yes?" Aran frowned, holding Ani's tentacle defensively. Well, maybe she's the only one that has all those modes of defense, but there are plenty of venomous animals on the planet. The crested herrings, for instance. I was bitten by one once when I was trying to observe their feeding patterns, and it knocked me out for 3 days, which is almost as much as the first time Ani stung me. On accident, I mean, he added hurriedly. If anything, this revelation had left the scientists looking even more shocked than before. And then there's the red-frilled mountain cats, he added. They're notorious for hunting humans, and not only do they have 5-centimeter claws, their newborn cubs also have venomous spurs on the inside of their front legs, which disappear as they reach adolescence. And the venomous spurs, who was it that discovered those? Asked one of the aliens, in a tone of voice that was somehow both terrified and resigned. Aran shifted again. Well, I did, I suppose, when I was out doing field work. He surveyed the faces in front of him, then shook his head. Look, why don't you tell me something about the fauna on your planet? I noticed the jungle cats have ridges in their back teeth, and I was wondering... The scientists were staring at each other now, their faces completely aghast. They do, said the first scientist who'd spoken. They do have ridges on their back teeth. But you've been on the planet for, 3 days now? How did you... He stopped speaking abruptly. Your land devil killed one, didn't she? His voice was now completely flat. "Do you know how much of our livestock, let alone our own people, those jungle cats kill every year? And your pet just—" "She only killed one or two," said Aran defensively. "And anyways, that wasn't how I found out." There was a string of words that the interpreter simply neglected to translate. "How did you find out?" she translated at last. There was a long silence that Aran didn't feel like breaking. "You—" The scientists were all staring at him now. You had your hand in one's mouth, didn't you, while it was still alive? You had your arm in the mouth of a jungle cat while it was still alive." Aran resisted with difficulty the urge to swear. It wasn't really like that. It was just... He trailed off, realizing nothing that he could say would salvage the situation at this point. "Perhaps," said the scientist at last, "perhaps it would be best if we moved on to a different topic." They asked some basic questions about the typical flora and fauna on Colorida and the type of subjects that the human scientists were researching. Aran answered as best he could, but he watched the scientists as they spoke. It was easy enough, since he always had to wait for the interpreter, so he was free to simply observe them. They were obviously highly uncomfortable about something. He couldn't tell what. And it wasn't just the unfortunate reaction to Ani's natural defenses either. They'd had the same air of unease even before the conversation had taken that unfortunate turn. It was well past midday, and Aran's stomach had started to protest from hunger when he finally turned to the interpreter. "I'd be very interested in seeing the scientific research they've been carrying on and observing some of their experiments," he said. "I'm more than happy to share what we've been doing as well, but the thing I'm most interested in is who put together the box that they sent through the portal. There's information in it that could be immensely helpful to us." There was the slightest moment of hesitation from the interpreter, but at last she turned and relayed his message to the others. Again, Aran picked up on that odd sense of unease. The scientists glanced at each other, and then the lead scientist made a small, nervous humming sound. "He says he's sure there are some matters of interest from the box, but he can't imagine that they would be of more import than the scientific studies that are happening in the laboratory," said the translator, turning back to Aran. "He invites you to observe them first, and then perhaps your questions about the box will answer themselves." Aran frowned slightly. "My question isn't a complicated one," he said. "I just want to meet the person who prepared the box. I have some questions for them." He paused a moment. There was some genetic information in it that might be the key to a cure for a genetic illness that's been plaguing us. I'm sure everyone back in Colorida would be grateful if you could... He broke off quickly, a tight combination of fear and urgency choking in his throat. He blinked hard, watching the scientists as the interpreter repeated his words. There was irritation in their postures, and under it, something like fear, but he frowned deeper. At the back of the group of scientists, there was one who was watching him. They hadn't dropped their eyes like all the others had at the mention of the box, and there was something in their posture that made Aran think that they were at least somewhat sympathetic. "He says, while he does appreciate your interest, he's quite certain you will get your questions answered in the labs much more easily than here. It would take some time to track down whoever it was who prepared the box, as it was likely one of hundreds sent out, and then they would have to determine which box was the one you were sent. While he's more than happy to help you, it will be a long process. In the meantime, he invites you to follow him down to the laboratory." Aran sighed and tipped his head. It seemed that this was the best he'd get at the moment. The relief in the lead scientist's posture was clearly evident. He gestured, and Aran followed the scientists from the room, Ani still grumbling discontentedly on his shoulder, and the interpreter walking, if possible, even farther away from him than she had when they'd entered the room. The laboratory was indeed fascinating, and he was so caught up in observing the Yibo's experiments that when the interpreter cleared her throat, he jumped. "I believe there will be a dinner provided in your rooms, if you're hungry," she said. "Oh, Yes, I'll be there in just a minute, he said distractedly, looking up from the microscope he'd been peering through. The scientific theories the Yibo were working on were fascinating and had the potential to improve science in Colorida by leaps and bounds when brought back. And in turn, he'd been able to nudge them in the right direction in various experiments of theirs, but he couldn't help but notice how any topic of genetics or DNA was subtly sidestepped. As he stood reluctantly to leave, he caught sight of the scientist he'd noticed during the meeting, the one who appeared sympathetic, standing next to the door as if waiting for something. They caught his eye as he approached, and he realized with a jolt that they were waiting for him. They touched his sleeve as he came up to them and said something in their chirping language. She said she was interested in what you'd said earlier. She said she hopes you don't mind her asking, but are you affected by the genetic illness? You seem distressed. He cleared his throat. Not me, he muttered. My friend. His voice wanted to choke again. The scientist watched him for a moment, then at last said something to the interpreter, gesturing Aran to follow her as she stepped into the hallway. Her name is Ree. The interpreter rolled the R heavily, making the name a sort of chirp. You said you were interested in the centrifuge experiment they were performing in the lab. She realizes it may not have been explained clearly and said it may be easier if she illustrates the process for you. He frowned in confusion as the scientist pulled out a writing surface and a writing stick. She bent and sketched a quick diagram, supporting the surface against her knee, and Aran peered over her shoulder. She'd drawn out 2 graphs that he could recognize fairly easily, and then in the corner, something else. Something that didn't look like an experiment at all. A long, thin box that was instantly familiar. And in front of it, a gash that looked like it could possibly be the portal. He stared at the drawing, then back at her. And this is, a subject you have particular expertise in? He asked, gesturing casually at the drawing of the box. She looked up at him, meeting his eye. It's not my specialty, no, but I know people who might specialize in it. The interpreter translated from behind him. The scientist's voice betrayed nothing, but Aran could feel his heart racing. There was something there. She might actually be able to get him some information. It was only the beginning, it was only a start, and he forced himself to clamp down on the hope that bubbled up in his chest. The scientist studied him for a moment, then seemed to make up her mind. There is a group of scientists going out into the jungle to check the experiments in our field lab and collect samples tomorrow, the interpreter translated. She is wondering if you'd be interested in coming along to watch. He stared at Ree, trying and failing to read her expression. But there was a reason she was asking him to come, and it had to do with the box, and that was enough for him. Tell her I'd be very interested, he said. The interpreter translated, then turned back. She says she'll pick you up outside the diplomatic quarters at sunrise. Ree watched until he'd tipped his head in acknowledgement, then turned and strode back towards the laboratory. Aran watched her go. Finally, he turned back to the patiently waiting interpreter and followed her back to the diplomatic quarters, his heart pounding quickly enough that he was dizzy with it. Chapter 10. Alba. Harach? Said Alba coldly, sitting down on the proffered stool. Her pulse was pounding quickly, a mixture of fury and cold fear. Alba, allow me to offer you something to drink. He came over to hand her one of the delicate cups of steaming liquid. Thank you, but I'm not thirsty, she said, ignoring the proffered cup. Harach studied her for a moment, then nodded politely, handing the cup to an aide and turning back to his own seat. Alba sat in icy silence, watching him. The tip of his tail twitched slightly, but even had it not, she could see the tension in every line of his posture. Alba, he said again, settling himself and turning back to her. You must allow me to express my apologies for what happened last evening. I truly had no knowledge of the danger until after it had occurred. He paused and added, lowering his voice, as a friend, I would advise you to warn your people against wandering alone in the streets, until we have worked out an agreement between us. Believe me, she said sharply, they have now been advised. But it escapes me how you expect me to enter into negotiations that will bear fruit if my people are terrified of your people, and, it would seem, for good reason." She took a deep breath, reining in her fury. A misstep could mean the death of another of the small group that was looking to her for their survival, and she couldn't ignore the sick guilt sitting hard and heavy under the fury. She'd been the cause of the death last night. Of that, she had no doubt at all. Another person lost with not even a body to bring home to his family. "I had hoped we could speak of that today," Herrick said. His posture broadcast his nervousness. "As you know, there are some few of us who have the translation implant, and Kachik is extremely interested in the fruits of our negotiations." The emphasis he put on the words was odd, and he glanced at one of the aides as he spoke. Alba kept her expression from registering her sudden unease. Could one of the aides be a spy, then? "Nonetheless," Herrick continued, lowering his voice still more, "I hope that you and I, at least, will be able to come to a mutual understanding. As I am aware of the various topics of discussion that could cause tensions to arise between our people, I may be able to steer the discussion in more productive directions while still assuaging your concerns." She watched him for a long moment, fighting down the sickness in her stomach. She hardly had a choice. They were at the Yibo's mercy, at least for the moment. Perhaps the Yibo were afraid of Ani, but as dangerous as the land devil was, there was only one of her. And the Yibo had shown, last night, that they could and would kill the humans if they felt so inclined, Ani or no Ani. All it would take in some cases, she was uncomfortably aware, was a simple denial of medical aid. And yet, they were still alive, which meant that the Yibo needed them for something. But what? And was Herrick willing to help them, or was he simply another spy? She was entering into a negotiation with world-altering stakes against opponents whose motives she didn't understand and whose ultimate objective was a mystery, and who could and would set the terms and the boundaries of the negotiations with no consultation on her part. She drew in a long breath. Perhaps the stakes were greater than she was used to, and perhaps the cost of a mistake was incalculably high. But this was a game she knew how to play. This was politics, and she'd cut her teeth on politics. "Very well," she said at last. "I sincerely hope that you are correct. I came all this way as part of a diplomatic mission because I had hoped that we would be able to establish mutually beneficial relations. If you wish for the same thing, I am certain we will be able to come to some sort of agreement." Herrick tipped his head to one side in approval. "I'm happy to hear it," he said. "I have no wish to speak of topics that are uncomfortable, so please do let me know if I am treading on sensitive ground," Alba continued, feeling the words out as she spoke them. "However, I believe it would be in both our best interests if we were to be frank about what our people wish to achieve from this negotiation." She paused. "For our part, we are interested in a mutual sharing of knowledge and commerce, opening trade, sharing scientific and technological data according to agreed-upon protocols. Over our time in the Joias System, we have learned that mutual cooperation can drive advancements and achievements that are impossible when one is locked into hostilities, and we wish to avoid that outcome. Some, even in my own government, believe cooperation is weakness, but we have advanced as far as we have in large part because we attempt first to negotiate before issuing threats, and our ability to defend ourselves when necessary has been greatly enhanced thereby." Herrick, she knew, was not a native speaker of the common dialect, but she had decades of practice in emphasizing just the right word in an innocuous phrase to highlight the fact that, while she was not, in fact, making a threat, she could. Herrick hesitated a moment, then tipped his head again. "An admirable goal," he said. His tone told her he was picking his way through a minefield with his words as much as she had been. "I am gratified to hear both of your peaceful intent and of your technological advancements that make such a peaceful intent possible." He'd heard the warning then, and wanted her to know it. "My people, unfortunately, have not had the advantages yours have had in that matter," he continued, his tone cautious and measured. As I told you, we had the encounter many years back with sapient species whose intentions were not peaceful. And in our own government, we have also encountered those who see force as a first option rather than a last. However, there are those of us who share your ideals, and... He paused a moment, casting a quick, involuntary glance at the aides. And I believe that, if we were able to demonstrate to them the benefits of peaceful negotiation... Peaceful negotiation to what end? Asked Alba again. Herrick's eyes darted around the room again, then came to rest on her. An alliance, he said quietly. As you said, a commitment to sharing knowledge, information, technology, commerce, mutual protection. Sibling nations, as it were. Something that would show those who are more concerned with war the strength that could come from peace. Alba frowned and stopped herself with an effort from glancing at Josip. Within negotiated bounds, of course, she said, her own words cautious. Of course, of course. Herrick tipped his head to one side. But, for the sake of both of our objectives, if yours truly what you tell me it is, it would be helpful if we could negotiate this settlement before the portal is reopened. And what am I to tell my diplomatic aides and my associates back on planet, coming back to them with a proposed agreement, if they have the same uncomfortable questions that had crossed my mind yesterday? She asked, keeping her voice low. Herrick's eyes widened in silent warning. Of course, I expect that if I present them with the explanations you gave me yesterday, they would be satisfied, she added, pitching her voice just a little louder so as to be overheard. The words tasted sour in her mouth, but she did not intend to be responsible for another death. Neither did she intend to allow Herrick to forget the entire matter. He paused a moment. That is excellent, of course, that there will not be such uncomfortable questions, he said at last. I assume it is because you will not bring such uncomfortable matters to their attention, but rather trust our goodwill, as befits allies. I would hope our relationship would be one of trust, one of family, sibling species. There was an emphasis on the words that made Alba look at him more closely, but his face gave nothing away. Now, he said, shall you and I speak of what such a relationship might look like? By the time she and Josip stood and took their leave of Herrick, the late afternoon sun was streaming through the airy windows, lending a soft, warm glow to the setting. Alba's head ached dully, her muscles stiff from the hard seat, but for the first time since she'd arrived on this mystery-forgotten planet, she felt as if she was beginning to find her balance. She still had no idea of what the Yibo didn't want her to know, or why. But she had at least something to go on. Family, sibling species. She watched the Yibo ambassador as he left them at the door. There were far too many similarities between the Yibo culture and her own for it to be mere chance, and as alien as these creatures were, she'd expected them to be more so. The differences here were skin-deep, more akin to the differences between Villa Nova do Sol and an obscure settlement in the depths of the Rim Mountains than between two unrelated species. And hadn't the Colorita scientists said something about the genetic sample that had been sent through the portal? Something about the genetics being strangely similar to humans? It didn't answer the question definitively, of course, nor did it solve the problems. But it was a start. I will see you again tomorrow, Alba, Herrick said, dipping his head and averting his eyes in the Yibo sign of respect. Thank you, she said, copying the gesture with rather less grace. But it was possible that they had, at least, one ally in this place. Not certain, but for once, possible. She and Josip didn't speak on the way back to their rooms. She was far too aware of the Yibo guides behind them. Their presence was nominally a courtesy. To be certain, Alba made it back to her room safely. But she'd seen the outline of weapons under their thin tunics, and the degree of plausible deniability was only a veneer barely substantial enough to deserve the name. Josip seemed to have come to a similar conclusion because He too didn't attempt to speak until they'd closed the door to Alba's room. "It would explain some things," he said quietly, when she'd finished laying out her thoughts. "If we're distantly related, perhaps through one of the generation ships we lost contact with centuries ago, it's possible the language was passed down through families. And if it were long enough in the past, it could also explain why we've seen no humans living here. If our two species could interbreed, it's possible that after enough years there'd be no one left who's fully genetically human. But the Maker's mark on that ball?" He shook his head. "It's not enough. They're hiding something, still." "I know," said Alba softly. "I intend to find out what, before I agree to recommend any course of action as to an alliance to the Council upon our return." He looked up sharply. "Madam, these people here, they're trusting their lives to us. We learned yesterday what happens if we step somewhere the Yibo don't want us to. Is asking those questions a risk you're comfortable taking?" "This is the fate of the entire Joias system at stake," she snapped. "Whether or not we ally with the Yibo could affect our future for generations." Josip closed his eyes for a moment, the weariness evident in his posture. "Perhaps you're right. Perhaps I'm not as used as you are to putting aside the well-being of the one for a hoped-for future benefit. But this crew trusts us. They came on this mission because they trusted we'd keep them safe. These are more than just pawns in a political game, Alba. These are people." "And so are the people back on Colorida," she said quietly. There was a tap on the door, and Alba glanced up. "I imagine that's Istve," said Josip, rising with an effort. "They told me they'd come check in on things when we got back and report on anything they'd found." He started for the door, but before he reached it, Istve pushed it open and stepped through. They wore their typical stubborn scowl, and the combination of the sweat and grime from a long day's labor and the exhaustion in their face made them look faintly piratical. "Josip," Istve said, their scowl dropping momentarily as they turned to him. There was a genuine affection in their tone, and Josip smiled. "Istve, how did things go today?" Istve gave a quick shake of their head and dropped down wearily on one of the stools. Alba bit back her irritation. She was accustomed to at least a nod of courtesy before someone took their seat in front of her. But she knew from experience that giving the slightest hint of her irritation to Istve would only egg them on. If she was back on Colorida... She broke off the thought. None of them were on Colorida right now, and the chances of any of them getting back there were largely dependent on their ability to work together. Which in this case meant, she supposed, that she'd have to take Istve's shocking lack of manners, or more likely their intentional provocation, in stride. "Did you find out anything important?" she asked after a moment, trying and likely failing to keep the sharpness from her tone. Istve glanced over at her in irritation, then sighed and ran a weary hand over their face. "It's difficult when we don't have any idea what they're saying," they said, tipping their head back. "Aran had his hands full with Ani, and Inez and I were trying to keep the survivors from panicking. Honestly, it's a bloody miracle they haven't yet locked in here like they are." They tipped their chin towards the door. "There's food out on the table. Inez is out there. I think she wanted to talk with you, Josip. She's been working on a translator program, and she said you'd have heard different words than she would have out here. She was hoping she could get some of the background recording from your wavelength." Josip glanced between Istve and Alba with a faint raise of his eyebrow, but nodded and got to his feet. "I'll go find her then. You don't want to come with me?" "I'll be there in a minute," said Istve. There was something grim about the set of their jaw, and for a brief, absurd moment, Alba felt a flash of something that could have been fear. Josip hesitated, then stepped out the door, and Alba felt an irrational urge to call him back. She didn't, though, just turned to face Istve with her most forbidding expression as the door slid shut. Istve was slumped down, elbows on the low table, chin resting on their hands, but as the door latch clicked, they looked up. "Did you tell the Yibo to offer to talk to Aran about their science?" they asked quietly. "Is that why they approached him yesterday?" She met Istve's eyes, despite the odd urge to look away. "Yes, I did," she said. "It's what he told me he wanted." Istve's gaze held hers. "And you're hoping he'll find something out for you?" She nodded. Istve narrowed their eyes. You're using him. He's using this expedition, she snapped. Don't tell me you don't know why he agreed to come. He has no interest in diplomacy, but he agreed to help if he could get what he wanted. I don't see how that's any different than what I'm doing. The ambassador I'm speaking with is nervous about something to do with that box that was sent through the portal. If Iran wants to help look for information through other means. Iran is focused on one thing right now, and one thing only, Istve said in a flat voice. And if you'd like to talk him out of it, you're welcome to try, and may the mystery grant you more success than it's granted me. They drew in a long breath and released it slowly. Listen, they said, their tone softer now. You're trying to keep everyone here alive. I get it, and I appreciate your efforts. There was a stiffness to their words, as if it was taking an effort to get them out. But leave Iran out of this, okay? You've done enough to him already. Asked him to come along on this stupid mission, for one, not to mention everything you did before. And the thing is, Iran's nice. He's a hell of a lot nicer than I am. And he tends to forgive and forget and believe the best of everyone. And they broke off, shaking their head. And look, I just don't want you to hurt him any more than you already have. That's all. Their voice was low, and they didn't meet her eye. She frowned. I'm not entirely sure what you mean. Istve was clearly too tired to be their normal antagonistic self, and she wasn't certain how to navigate this unaccustomed vulnerability on their part. Istve looked up again and met her gaze challengingly. You don't know what I mean, they repeated in a flat tone. Then they shook their head and laughed, a short, bitter laugh. Of course you don't know what I mean. You probably didn't even think about it, did you? Alba's frown deepened. I assure you, she said tartly, I have no idea what you're talking about. The first time I had any dealings with Iran, other than official council business, was when I requested his presence on this mission, and you can believe me that I regret this turn of events as much as any of us. She paused. Unless you're referring to the reforms that ensured he, and presumably you as well, were able to complete your education in the first place, and had the qualifications necessary to be asked to accompany me. And I hardly think you can blame me for... Istve gave a short, incredulous laugh. That's what you... They stopped, shaking their head. Your reforms sent Iran and me to university. Sure, you did that. But do you know how many of the kids we grew up with they sent to prison? You, personally, sent to prison with your damn reforms? They leaned forward, and she fought the urge to lean away. I didn't send anyone to prison, she said acerbically. I merely passed a handful of laws that were part of a holistic package to assist those living on the streets. Istve's eyes flashed. Assist those living on the streets, they repeated. I lived on the streets. I know you know that. The news packets make a big deal of it every time they write something about Iran. They call me a former homeless child. My mother was one of those people you were trying to get rid of with your holistic package. I guess you think people on the streets live there for fun? Alba was discomfited by the intensity of their gaze and wished, irrationally, that failure was there. Living on the streets leads to a number of undesirable outcomes in children and adults alike, she snapped. I'm not sure why you are trying so hard to find malice behind... I'm not sure why you think that if we'd had a better option, my mother wouldn't have taken it instead. My friends wouldn't have taken it instead, broke in Istve, their voice as sharp as her own. Do you really think that people too poor to afford a home are also too stupid to know what's best for them? Colorita isn't a backwater village in the Rim Mountains. There are shelters and... Shelters, yes, where you move every damn night and you can't leave your things without someone stealing them. Where you sleep in a room with 100 other people and you don't get a moment of privacy? Would you raise your child like that if you had a child? Do you really blame my mother? You really think she's stupid for raising me on the street, where at least we had our own space, instead of inside one of those hellholes? They do their best, I'm sure. They don't have much funding, but they do what they can, because Colorita is a humane planet. Just like you said, isn't it? Where you treat even lowly beggars right, You don't let even the worthless homeless kids starve. Happy to provide them a nice, comfortable jail cell with 3 hot meals a day. She just stared at them, shocked at the intensity in their voice. The choice you gave our friends, Iran and me, get off the streets or go to prison. You think any of us wouldn't have got off the streets if we had a better option? Look, you think Iran and I are worth something because you can damn well use us. I promise you, even if Iran wasn't a damn genius, he'd still be 10 times the person you are. But you could make that decision for us because you, in your infinite wisdom, knew what we needed better than we did. Did you ever think to ask us, even once? Or were we so far below your notice that there was no need? Alba was still staring at them. She felt, somehow, as though she couldn't pull in enough oxygen. She'd gotten some pushback on that particular set of laws, she remembered, but no one had given her a convincing argument as to why they should be changed, although some of the counselors had grumbled at the cost, and she'd given those individuals with potential, such as Iran and this ungrateful, irritating friend of his, the chance of a better life, a university education, a steady job. It had been for their own good. Despite what Istve said, every person who'd been taken to prison had been taken there, only after they refused every other viable option. All they had to do to stay out of prison was get clean, move into a shelter, accept meaningful employment, she began. Istve slapped their open palm down on the table, and the noise startled her into silence. All they had to do was get clean. Their voice wasn't even angry anymore, just a sort of weary resignation. Get clean. Go live in one of your benevolent shelters. Get a job. Simple as that, right? They looked up, and again she was startled by the intensity in those brown eyes. Would it matter to you? They said softly. Would it even matter to you if I told you that one of the girls Iran and I grew up with died in prison? She died there. Just get clean, right? That's all she had to do. Sounds simple. You have no idea. They broke off, shaking their head. You just trample roughshod over everyone's lives for their own damn good, and you don't even bother looking back at the wreckage you leave behind. They stood, leaning wearily against the table, then straightened with an effort. They turned back for a moment, measuring her with their eyes. You never had to deal with someone drinking or shooting up, because it was better than whatever the hell was happening inside their head, did you? I guess I should envy you. She drew in a sharp breath, and for a moment a face danced in her memory. Dark, mischievous eyes, laughing, teasing mouth, devil-may-care smile. She shoved the memory away. Perhaps not, she snapped, but a doctor doesn't have to contract a disease to know how to treat it. Istve was still studying her. At last, they turned away. Maybe not, they said bitterly, but they'd be a damn poor doctor if they didn't listen to their patient when they say the treatment is killing them. They hit the door control, and the door whispered open. I'm going to bed. If there's anything else we need to talk about, we can talk in the morning. Just leave Iran alone, okay? That's all I'm asking. Then they were gone, and the door slid shut behind them. Alba watched after them for a long time. She shivered and pushed herself to her feet. The ache in her legs at the movement was almost welcome. At least the pain was enough to help clear the memories. She'd been trying to help. It only made sense that someone with years of experience, someone with education and ability, would be in the best place to make such decisions. And most people agreed her measures had been a success, striking an appropriate balance between strictness and kindness. At the very least, it had curbed the population of homeless on the streets of Dosol, which had been growing increasingly out of control. But there was that look in Istve's eyes as they'd stepped out the door, a mix of anger and mockery, resignation, pity. And under it, a sharp hurt, pain that even after all these years hadn't gone away. She realized she was clenching her fists tightly enough that her fingernails dug into her palms. Josip stepped back into the room a short time later. When he saw her, his forehead creased in concern. Madam, are you all right? He glanced around quickly. Where's Istve? They didn't meet Ines and me in the dining hall. They went to bed, she said. Josip nodded slowly and sat down on the stool across from her. What happened? Nothing, said Alba irritably. Istve expressed their deeply held belief that I was looking for a way to hurt Iran, who apparently hung the moon in the sky and then left. Josip was watching her, and she looked away from him deliberately. The two of them sat in silence for a few moments. "Do you ever wonder," she said, almost to herself, "whether we're doing the right thing?" Josip looked up, startled out of his reverie. He studied her for a moment, his bright brown eyes creased with sympathy. "I wonder that every day of my life," he said at last, quietly. He rose. "And now, I suppose we'd best follow Istve's and Inez's example and get some sleep. I have a feeling tomorrow will be another long day." She watched the doorway for a while after he left, and at last made her slow way into her sleeping chamber. But the strange unease brought on by Istve's words, and the haunting memories they had conjured in her mind, memories she couldn't exorcise even after all these years, made her dreams restless and troubled. Chapter 11. Savina. "Savina, I hear you've been threatening my people when I send you out on jobs." Yor's voice was cold and dangerous. Savina dimpled at her, fiddling with the small, needle-thin knife in her hand. The aliens had stopped trying to disarm her once she'd proved that she could be as deadly with a shard of broken glass as she was with her knives. At least one of these aliens, Yibo, as they called themselves, would wear a scar to remember that lesson by. "I don't remember threatening anyone," she said, "although—" she tapped her chin with one finger, "although I do remember one of your people trying to sabotage the hit. I explained to him very nicely that he shouldn't do that, and that was the end of it, I think." She glanced up, catching Yor's gaze. "You've seen me work. If I'd wanted them dead, there'd be no one here to complain, would there?" Yor looked at her for a long time, her eyes bright with a mixture of distrust and fury. "You've been useful, Savina," she said at last, "but don't forget your place." She paused. "I don't have any jobs for you today, so you're out helping to bring in packages from the warehouse, and I don't want to hear another complaint about you." Savina gave her an insincere smile, still fiddling with her knife. "I can't imagine you would." The cargo they were supposed to bring in was from one of the warehouses near the center of the city. Joska was waiting when she arrived, and one of Yor's crew bosses, Yika, gestured Savina over to join her, scowling. She sidled up beside her as they walked. "Yika," she said, and the woman turned with a start. "What is it, human?" she asked at last. "Why did Yor saddle you with this job?" Savina's voice was light with sympathy. "I thought I'd heard that you were supposed to be a crew boss. How did you end up getting sent out like this, in the middle of the day, with two dangerous criminals?" Yika glowered at her, and Savina blinked, widening her eyes. "I'm sorry, I really am just curious." She paused a moment and lowered her voice. "Aren't you afraid of the Kari?" As she'd expected, the Yibo woman flinched, almost unconsciously. "What are you talking about?" she hissed. "What did they have to do with anything?" Savina widened her eyes further, hiding a small, triumphant smile. Maybe I misunderstood. I thought they only came out in the mornings." The Yibo woman cocked her head in puzzlement, then gave a brief snort of annoyance. "Someone told you that? You don't even know what they are, do you?" She slowed, turning to face Savina, and her face was serious. "Trust me, human, you should count yourself lucky. It's not just us they hunt. Humans are a delicacy. You're not the first human we've seen in this system, and you won't be the last." They wait. They sit on the sidelines, and they wait. And when they see an opening, they stream through and hunt. And you don't have the protections we have. You don't have force fields over your cities. We do. And even then, they get in here sometimes. Someone gets tempted by the profits, thinks they're smart enough to strike a bargain, and lets them through. And you? You think you're so frightening, I know, but you're nothing but livestock. She turned away and ignored any further attempts at conversation. Savina moved back until she was walking beside Joska, her thoughts spinning. "What was that about?" Joska asked. Savina shrugged and gave the woman her best smile. "I don't know. There was something they were talking about the other day that they seemed frightened of. I was just trying to make sure it wasn't something we needed to worry about. Joska watched Savina. I'm never going to get you to tell me what you're really up to, am I? She said at last. You know, sometimes having friends can actually be helpful. We're not friends, Savina snapped. Joska smiled. Allies, then, at least. Savina narrowed her eyes and looked away. When they reached the warehouse, a good 30 minutes' walk from the safe house, the Yibo set Savina and Joska to work loading up the transport drones. It was late morning, and the sun was hot enough that sweat beaded on Savina's skin in the thick, humid air, prickling under her hairline and dripping uncomfortably down her face. She was used to heat, but the heat in the Rim Mountains was dry and sharp, not the sticky wet of this place. The air here smelled of a strange mixture of refuse and greenery. The Yibo, she'd gathered, had an obsession with trees and plants. And even if they hadn't, this seemed the kind of place where things grew whether you wanted them to or not. Flowers sprouting through cracks in the cement, moss and vines creeping up the smooth surfaces of the buildings. The Yibo watched the humans as they worked, leaned back against the side of the alley. It wasn't until they were almost finished, and most of the Yibo had started back after the drones, that Savina felt that faint, tickling unease in the back of her mind, that sense of something wrong. She dived out of the way, and only as she was rolling on the pavement, only as, in the back of her head, she heard the ting of a weapon, heard Joska's quiet grunt of pain, did she realize where she'd been standing. In front of Joska. She rolled to her feet, muscles tight with panic, and looked back to the wall she'd been standing against. Joska was leaned against it, and blood trickled down her collar. Savina leapt forward, heart hammering, and grabbed the woman, shoving her down into an alley. Then she looked down at the wound, almost not wanting to see. The spike had passed so close to Joska's neck that it had cut a thin line across the skin under her ear, but other than that, she was unhurt. Savina let out a shaky sigh of relief, and then a wave of fury washed over her, so strong it almost left her lightheaded. I'll kill her, she muttered, turning to where their supervisor had been standing. She was gone. And then she glanced down at the spike in her hand, and the boiling anger in her blood turned suddenly to ice. This weapon style was one that she recognized. Something she'd known back on Colorida, which meant, "What in the system?" Joska began. Savina shoved her pistol into the woman's hands. "It's Reka! You take this! I'm going to bloody well kill her!" She stepped out into the street quickly, tracing the path the weapon must have taken. From the corner of her eye, she saw the briefest flicker of movement, visible for just an instant before disappearing around the corner of the alley. The figure's sensual grace still had the power to make Savina's throat dry and her pulse pound. Reka Soler. Savina took after her at a dead run. She kept to the walls, dodging in and out of shelter, a mix of fury and guilt and sick attraction churning in the pit of her stomach. Reka had almost killed Joska, and it had happened because of Savina. When she'd endangered people before, it had always been part of the game. Anyone stupid enough to get in her way deserved to be her shield against people who were too squeamish to use the tools they'd been given. But for some reason, this suddenly felt far, far too personal. She rounded a corner, and another spike hit the wall millimeters from her head. She dived to the ground and came up with a flare in one hand, tossing it overhand in the direction the shot had come from. There was a muffled explosion and a sharp gasp, and she rounded the corner in time to see Reka stagger, knocked off balance. Savina yanked out her knife and threw it. It hit Reka, skidding against her gray suit, and embedded itself in the woman's arm. Reka turned, and for just a moment, Savina's eyes locked with hers. The cold, implacable hatred in those slate, hazel eyes pierced Savina, as sharp as the knife she'd just thrown. Blood dripped from Reka's arm, where Savina's knife was still embedded. The woman didn't even glance at it, just reached down, her eyes never leaving Savina's, yanked it out with a quick jerk, and tossed it scornfully to the ground. Even the disdain in the gesture was a magnetic pull Savina couldn't tear her eyes from. Her chest was oddly tight, and for just a moment she couldn't breathe. With a movement that was graceful and fluid, and almost too quick to follow, Reka pulled out a small, hand-held crossbow, and Savina barely had time to dive into an alley before a bolt shattered on the wall behind her. When she peered out, Reka was long gone. Savina's heart was pounding as she got shakily to her feet. She brushed the dust off of her tunic in irritation. Of course her heart was pounding. She'd just been running, after all, and she'd almost been killed. It had nothing at all to do with the way Reka had met her gaze, yanked out Savina's knife and tossed it down like a challenge, as if the blood streaming down her arm wasn't worth her notice. Nothing at all to do with the fact that Savina would probably be cursed with another 3 days of tangled, restless dreams, of Reka's hands twisting in her collar, shoving her up against the alley wall, those cold hazel eyes boring into hers. Savina sucked in a long breath and turned back to where she'd left Joska. Joska met her halfway there. She took in Savina's disheveled state with a raised eyebrow. "So, your first reaction when you're faced with a murderous government agent is to run after them on your own?" she asked in a dry tone. Blood stained the collar of her tunic, but it was clear that it had been no more than a scratch. It hadn't been serious at all, but for some reason the memory of Joska with blood dripping from her neck, the crossbow bolt embedded in the wall beside her, still made Savina's blood go cold. "Are you all right?" Savina asked brusquely. Joska gave her a quick smile. "It's pretty clear she wasn't trying to kill me." She paused a moment, the smile reaching the corners of her eyes. "If I didn't know any better, I'd think you were worried about me. And here I thought you were a heartless murderer." Savina glared at her, then gestured down the street with a jerk of her head. "I am a heartless murderer," she snapped, "but I don't know how to pilot a ship well enough to get us off this damn place." The smile tugged at the corners of Joska's mouth again, but she nodded, and they started back down towards the safe house. Savina's heart was still pounding oddly. Reka was still after her. Reka hadn't gone with Alba and the others. Somehow, she was out here on the streets, stalking Savina, waiting for her. She shivered. They had to get out. They had to get away. She had to get Benny and Nicolau and the others to safety. Then she could find a way to deal with Reka. If Reka were dead, there'd be no one in the diplomatic party who would know who she was. She'd have time to plan her next move, but here, with Ur, she was trapped. No way to keep herself safe, no way to keep anyone safe. She got out, or they'd all be killed. Even then, they get in here sometimes. Someone gets tempted by the profits, thinks they're smart enough to strike a bargain and lets them through. Yika's words echoed in her mind. She had no idea what these Kari creatures were, but if it was true, if they were sapient enough to strike a bargain with, she'd do it. She'd find a way to let them in. Because as far as she was concerned, this entire Yibo city could burn. Chapter 12. Aran. Aran. He looked up, startled, to see Istve leaning against the doorframe to his room. Their face was drawn with strain, and there was exhaustion behind their expression, and Aran had to fight back the twinge of guilt that settled in his stomach at the sight of his friend. He'd hardly spoken with Istve since they'd arrived in the compound 3 days ago. He told himself it was because they were both busy and they both had too many things to do, but the truth was he'd been secretly hoping that their paths wouldn't cross. Not yet. He knew Istve disapproved of what he was doing. He knew Istve wanted only to get the Yibo to release them, to open the portal, and that Istve was on the verge of losing their actual crap. He wasn't sure he was ready, just yet, to start a fight with Istve about how much their life was worth. "Istve," he said, trying to smile. "How are the negotiations going?" Istve stepped inside, and glancing around, sat down on one of the stools that the Yibo seemed convinced that humans preferred as furniture. "I don't know," they said quietly. "It's hard to say at the moment." They brushed a hand across their face in a weary, unconscious gesture that made Aran's chest hurt just a little. "What about you?" They looked up at him, attempting a smile of their own. Aran averted his gaze. It's going all right. I spoke with some of the scientists. We're going out to collect some samples today in the jungle." Istve glanced at the disarray of the room. You're just collecting samples, they said, and there was a quiet note in their voice that told Aran they knew he wasn't telling them everything. He managed a small grin. One of the scientists invited me to come along. Istve watched him for a long moment, and then they stood abruptly, a flash of frustration on their face. Aran, I know you're not going to listen to anything I have to say. Honestly, I should be used to it by now, but I'm not stupid. Don't bloody lie to me. Aran clenched his teeth against the sick feeling coiling around his chest. I'm not lying to you, he said, more sharply than he'd intended. I'm going out to collect samples. Istve was still studying him, and there was still that sharp flash of anger in their expression. And that's all you're doing, they said in a flat voice. Aran hesitated a moment, then sighed, looking down. It is what I'm doing, but I hoped that the scientist who invited me might be able to give me some information about the box. Istve gave a quick shake of their head. I don't have to ask what information you want, they said grimly. But can't you at least wait until we know we have a way off of this place before you try to get yourself killed again? Wait until at least we know what these Yibo want and we have a chance of surviving this. Aran glared back at them. And if we do find a way back home, I have no guarantee anyone will wait until we find a cure before we leave here, do I? No guarantee that once the portal's opened, we won't just go back through and let it close behind us. Because as far as I can tell, you don't actually give a damn about this. Or am I wrong? He could tell from the tight press of Istve's lips that his words had hit their mark. Listen, Aran, they said, their voice strained. I get that this is important to you, and I'm touched, honestly. But you know damn well this is dangerous. They killed someone 2 days ago as a warning, remember? And now you're risking your life recklessly for... This time, Aran stood as well, his heart pounding. I'm being reckless? He snapped. And your life is worthless. You're acting like we could just walk out of here. I could just walk out of here knowing that you're going to die within a year. And I should be fine with that. If you're not going to damn well care, Istve, then who else is going to? I'm not the reckless one here, Istve snapped back. I'm just trying to keep all of us alive. Not all of us, said Aran in a low voice. Not you. And I'm not going to let you selflessly sacrifice your life for the greater good. And what's your alternative? Asked Istve, their voice short. You'll sacrifice your life for the greater good? They paused a moment, clearly trying to regain control. Aran, they said at last, you say you want to save my life, but how do you think I'd feel, knowing that you'd been trying to save my life when you... They broke off, turning away. Aran drew in a long, shaky breath. And how do you think I'd feel, knowing that I could have saved you and I didn't? For a long moment, neither of them spoke. At last, Istve turned. Their face was still strained, and their voice still tight with irritation, but they made an effort to smile. I don't know why I thought I could make you listen to me, they said, and their tone cut Aran like a knife. But if I can't get you to listen and I can't get you to talk to me, can you? Can you at least promise to be careful? There was something tired and vulnerable in their expression, and Aran wondered suddenly how much they'd slept in the last 3 days. If they'd slept at all. They were standing there, watching him, and he swallowed hard. He could lie, of course, but Istve had always been able to see through his lies. And anyways, with the look on their face right now, he didn't think he'd be able to bear to. I'll be as careful as I can, he said at last. He didn't have to look at Istve to know they'd heard exactly what he'd said, and exactly what he hadn't. He'd be as careful as he could without risking his ultimate goal. Istve's expression hardened, just a little. I suppose that's the best I'll get out of you, they said, and there was a touch of bitterness in their voice that almost made Aran want to take it back. Almost. But even now he could see the hollowness under their cheekbones, the dark circles beneath their eyes, how their hands shook, in a way that couldn't be explained by simple exhaustion or strain or stress. So instead, he just nodded. Istve sighed. Well, I hope I'll see you tonight then, they said at last, their voice still bitter. Although I guess that's not really important, right? They turned away. and were gone before Aran had time to formulate an answer. "What are we doing, Ani?" he whispered, leaning his cheek against the comforting bulk of her on his shoulder. "What the hell am I doing wrong?" Ani chirped, rubbing a delicate tentacle across his face, and he stroked her gently, but somehow he couldn't make himself smile. By the time he got to the courtyard outside, where he was going to meet Ree, he'd somehow managed to put the interaction far enough out of his mind that he could actually focus on the task at hand. But he couldn't stop his brain from turning the words over and over in his head, replaying again and again the hurt look on Istvay's face as they stepped out the door. He hated hurting Istvay. He'd always hated hurting Istvay. But as much as he hated it, watching them die and knowing he might have done something to stop it would be worse. It would be 1,000,000 times worse. Ree was already there, and she gave him that close-lipped smile that seemed to be a common greeting among the aliens. Aran smiled back, remembering just in time to keep his lips closed so as not to turn the friendly gesture into a threat. He couldn't speak her language, and she couldn't speak his, so he simply waved at his pack to show that he was ready. She tipped her head to one side and gestured to a small transport. It looked much smaller than he was comfortable with. Honestly, anything that was going to be picking him off the ground and hurtling him through the air would be smaller than he was comfortable with. But this looked closer to a bike than a transport. She climbed on and gestured impatiently. Aran swallowed hard and climbed on after her. Ani's tentacles tightened on his shoulder as they started down the bustling streets. The transport was barely big enough for the two of them, but Ree drove it with every sign of competence. Still, the speed at which the ground flew past beneath them made Aran feel slightly nauseous, and he gripped the edges of the transport hard enough that his knuckles were white. When at last they reached the city gates, Ree tapped something into the glowing gate screen. 2 guards appeared a few moments later, and she handed them a token, which they scanned. Then they stepped back and beckoned the transport forwards, and Ree drove straight for the force field barrier. Aran closed his eyes and clutched on tighter, squeezing one eye open just as they reached it. But at the last second, the force field shimmered and parted, and they were through. He let out a shallow breath of relief and glanced down, then groaned. Opening his eyes may have been a mistake. As bad as it had been to watch the city streets slipping away below him, watching the dark green of the jungle rush by beneath them was somehow even more viscerally terrifying. He swallowed hard, and Ree turned back to him, saying something in her strange, chirping language. He had no idea what she was saying, of course, but from the tone of her voice, he guessed it was some expression of concern. He shook his head and tried to smile instead of looking sick. She asked again, and he made an incoherent, panicked sound, pointing ahead of them. She made that soft, humming sound that was the Yibo equivalent of laughter, and turned back to her driving. He squeezed his eyes closed again. He didn't care how much she laughed at him, as long as he survived this damn trip. Ani tightened her tentacles down on his shoulder, picking up on his distress, and gave a worried growl. He didn't have to look to know her bulbous eyes were peering around, trying to find the source of the threat. He managed a weak smile. "It's okay, Ani," he whispered, stroking one of her tentacles. I don't like flying is all." She growled again, but settled a little, and he breathed a small sigh of relief. At last, Ree brought their small craft down in a clearing, where a small group of scientists waited with clear impatience. She gestured Aran to follow and walked briskly over to her colleagues, speaking to them quickly in their rapid, chirping speech. After a short conversation in which the other scientists looked at Aran skeptically, Ree came over to him and said something in a slow, clear tone. At his look of utter incomprehension, she sighed and made a motion with her fingers as of 2 legs walking. Apparently they'd be going on foot from here. He glanced around, trying to figure out why. This part of the jungle looked no different from the part they'd driven through. He made a questioning gesture, and she tried to say something, then stopped, shook her head, and gestured him to follow. Maybe he could get a translator to tell him what she meant when they got back. They didn't walk long before they reached a small dome, constructed of the same odd, light-refracting glass that the city buildings were made of, and protected by a large force field. The scientists' relief was palpable as they stepped inside, the visible tension in their bodies releasing once the sky was once again filtered through the faint, translucent haze of the force field. Aran stood watching for a few minutes as the scientists went about their work. He couldn't understand their words, and there was no interpreter along, but there was something soothing and universal in the way they checked their screens, examined their equipment, frowned down at the neat rows of plants in the raised beds. Psst! He started and turned quickly. Ree stood behind him, a furtive look on her face and obvious tension in her posture. She beckoned to him, making a gesture that he guessed meant quiet. He turned to follow, his heart beating faster now. She glanced quickly around, then stepped to the force field, grabbed his arm, and, after tapping the tech device on her wrist, pulled him through after her. And then they were out and into the jungle proper. "What?" he began, but she repeated her gesture of earlier and beckoned him again to follow, pulling a smaller version of one of the Yibo weapons from her knapsack. Aran could feel Ani perk up as they ducked into the dense undergrowth. Ree held her weapon in front of her cautiously as they pushed their way through the heavy vines, and Aran pulled out his bushknife, cutting through tangles of vines too thick for him and Ree to crawl through. They couldn't have made it more than a few hundred meters before Ani's grumbling purr changed to an uneasy growl. Aran glanced around quickly. "What is it, girl?" he murmured. "What's the matter?" Ree glanced up, her expression halfway between concern and irritation. She might be right to be irritated, honestly. Knowing Ani, this could be a wild animal preparing to attack them, or a funny-shaped leaf that she found insulting. The volume of Ani's growl increased, changing towards her high-pitched tea-kettle whistle, and she shifted on Aran's shoulder. Ree was looking around warily now, but at last she gave a short shake of her head and turned back to the jungle ahead of them. Aran almost didn't see it either. He almost thought, for just a moment, that maybe it was just a funny-shaped leaf. And then something that had been niggling at the edge of his mind for a few moments now finally caught, and he realized the shadow on the ground around them was odd and darker than it should have been, and not entirely tree-shaped. He shouted a warning. Ree spun around at the panic in his voice, and then her mouth gaped open in a way that would, in another situation, have been almost comical. She grabbed his arm, yanking him after her as the massive shadow, which had been slowly descending, dropped on them like a falling stone. He caught a glimpse of the massive, formless pancake of a body, absurdly tiny legs, and teeth. Far, far too many teeth. Far more teeth than should have been possible, even for a creature with a circumference roughly the size of an abandoned escape pod. He dived at the last moment, shoving Ree forward, and they rolled, barely missing the outside edge of the creature, which, now that Aran saw it in closer proximity, was much too bulky to look like a pancake. Then they'd both scrambled to their feet and were off running. The creature moved far, far too quickly for its bulk, and it would be around in front of them in a moment. Aran skidded to a halt, but Ree, ahead of him, wasn't quite fast enough. She tripped, sprawling out on the jungle floor in front of the creature. Aran grabbed for his bushknife in a sort of hopeless panic. And then Ani had launched herself off his shoulder towards the creature. "Ani!" he shouted, and then she was on top of it, eye pouches bulging comically, hissing so loudly half the jungle could probably hear it. The creature, whatever it was, had retreated at her attack, and although he could see her lashing it with her tentacle spikes and burying the fangs of her second external mouth into its bulk, it hadn't yet succumbed to her venom. It was clearly mad with rage, though, thrashing and rolling, trying to buck her off, and liable to smash Ree in the process. He grabbed the scientist by the jacket and dragged her back out of the way, then yanked her to her feet and pointed back towards the biodome. "Go!" he shouted over the sounds of Ani's hissing. "Get out of here! I'll get Ani!" Ree grabbed his arm and tried to pull him after her, but he shook her off. "I can't leave Ani," he said through his teeth. "Go!" He turned back to the struggle. Ani clung on with all 8 tentacles and probably her beak, but he could see by her little jerking movements that the interaction was not playing out exactly as she'd expected. Still, she clung on grimly, every tentacle sucker suctioned down onto the amorphous body of the creature. He wouldn't be able to pull Ani off the beast. Even if he did, as pain and rage maddened as it clearly was, it would likely lash out and kill him, or Ani, or both. And in the state she was in, Ani likely wouldn't be up for listening if he asked her nicely to come. There had been, he reflected ruefully, many situations over the last 3 years in which Ani hadn't been up for listening. He bit his lip, taking stock. The creature was thrashing wildly, but its movements were less coordinated than they had been. The venom must be taking effect then, slowly. But, damn it to hell. One of Ani's tentacles was sinking into the creature's gelatinous body. He swore under his breath and grabbed up a branch, starting cautiously towards Ani and her opponent. He could hear, distantly, Rhys shouting something. He didn't need to understand her words to have a fairly solid guess as to what that something might be, but damn it. He'd almost lost Ani just a few days ago, and he wasn't about to do it again. He was close enough now to almost be able to reach out and touch the struggling creatures. "Ani!" he whispered. The pancake beast spun, and he jerked up his stick just in time as dozens of teeth clamped down, the animal's full attention swinging to land on him. He realized, in complete fascination, that the outside rim of the creature's entire body was covered in small eyes, a mesmerizing discovery, but somewhat unnerving when all of those 30, 50, 100 eyes were turned balefully on him. Very gently, Aran let go his grip on the stick and held out his hand, making his posture as non-threatening as he knew how. "Hello there," he murmured. "Not having a very good day, are you?" The thing pounced. Aran snatched up another stick, jamming it into the creature's jaws as its massive bulk descended on him. Ani was hissing like a punctured air cylinder. "Ani! Leave it!" he shouted desperately. The beast splintered the stick in its teeth, tearing it from Aran's hands with a quick twisting motion. He noticed, vaguely, that Rhys' shouts from behind him had stopped, replaced with a series of horrified, disbelieving squeaks, but he didn't really have time to pay attention. "Easy, beautiful! I'm not going to hurt you!" he yelped, rolling out of the way as it dropped to the ground right where he'd been standing. "Ani! Come on, damn it!" He dived behind a tree as the beast lunged at him again, its attention split now between him and Ani. Ani growled discontentedly, but was reluctantly trying to pull her tentacles free of the creature's body. "That's good. Just let her go," Aran panted. "Just let her go, and you can go sleep it off. We'll get out of your hair." The tree he dodged behind opened a gaping mouth, and he swore again and leapt backwards. Hell, he'd forgotten to watch out for smooth-barked, carnivorous trees in the excitement. "Ani, come on!" Both Ani and the creature now seemed more than willing to part company. 2 of Ani's tentacles pulled free with the wet sucking sound, followed by a third, and she tugged her bulbous body towards Aran. With a soft pop, the last of her stuck tentacles popped free, and Ani, rolling like a drunken sailor, hurtled across the beast's body towards him, launching herself off its back, her skin flaps spread. Aran held out his arm to her, then realized and hastily yanked down the sleeve of his jacket to cover his bare skin before Ani landed heavily and scuttled up onto his shoulder. The beast in front of him bridled, straightening, its eyes snapping back to him and its posture going tense. "It's all right," Aran gasped in his calmest voice, taking a step backwards. "It's all right. We'll just get out of your way now." The beast made another mock charge, and Ani tensed. Aran grabbed desperately for her tentacle with one hand and a stick with the other, and somehow jammed a branch between the needle-sharp rows of teeth descending on him. The beast bit. The branch bit back. Ani hissed, and, his hand clamped firmly around Ani's tentacle, Aran ran. Rhys, who seemed almost dumb with shock, turned when she saw him coming, and the 2 of them fled as fast as their legs would carry them. Aran risked a glimpse over his shoulder. The thing was gliding after them, its many legs propelling it along between the trunks of the trees as easily as they would along the ground. But there was an unsteadiness to its movements that told him it wasn't operating at full capacity. Thank the great mystery itself, or rather thank Ani and her venom, because he was pretty damn sure that there was no way they could have outrun that thing on a normal day. Ree grabbed his sleeve and yanked him into a thick stand of trees, where presumably the creature's bulk would make it unable to follow. He just had time to notice the ruins of a large spacecraft lying on its side, the ground around it odd and lumpy, before she shoved him up the loading ramp. Once they were both inside, she dropped to the ground and leaned back against one of the battered walls, shaking visibly. Aran glanced around quickly. Then he frowned. This craft was an escape shuttle. From the diplomatic ship, he was almost certain of it. But he was also very certain he hadn't rescued anyone from this area of the jungle. He glanced through the small entrance at the thick trees outside, feeling mildly sick to his stomach. The shuttle was big enough to have seated at least 100 people. It may not have been fully filled when it took off, but still. He glanced down at his scanner. Not even the faintest sign of life inside, other than himself, Ani, and Ree. Whoever had been in this shuttle could have found their way out. Somehow. It was possible. But his mind flashed back to the small, incongruous mounds outside the door of the shuttle. Mounds that would, he was pretty sure, be about the size of a human body once the jungle had covered it. He pushed back a taste of guilty nausea at the thought. There was nothing he could do for them now. The pancake beast prowled around the outside of the stand of trees for a while, its multitude of tiny eyes glittering pools of hatred, but even if it found a way in, it would never get through the tiny spacecraft door. At last, it seemed to give the whole thing up as a bad job and vanished back into the treetops. Now they were apparently out of danger. Aran's muscles had gone a bit shaky as well. He peeled his hand loose from Ani's tentacles, and it was only when Ree made a sharp sound that he realized that the skin on his palm had been eaten almost completely through, raw flesh showing through peeling, blistered skin. The scientist snapped out something that was probably a curse, gesturing at him to take off his jacket, and then he realized what must have happened and did as she asked, his fingers fumbling in haste. Just in time, it appeared, whatever had coated Ani's tentacles had already eaten through most of the jacket, and would probably have eaten straight into his shoulders already if he hadn't been wearing his field jacket, made with 3 layers of muskox hide. While he stripped it off carefully, Ani still attached to the shoulders, Ree fumbled in her pouch, pulling out a water bottle and a packet of powder. She grabbed Aran's wrist and jerked his hand towards her, dumped the contents of the water bottle over his hand, then ripped the pouch open with her teeth and sprinkled a white, chalky powder over the raw skin. He watched with interest as she treated the injury. He didn't feel any pain, which meant whatever the creature secreted, it clearly had an anesthetic quality to it. Perhaps it would be worth studying if they could isolate some of it. Then he saw the look on Ree's face. He swallowed hard, suddenly uncomfortably aware of how it would not have taken much longer before it was bone instead of flesh peeping through the blistered, broken skin of his hand. As a shock of the cold water eased, he could feel sensation beginning to return, which, now he considered it, wasn't something he was particularly looking forward to. Ree yanked a bandage out of her pouch and wrapped his hand quickly and efficiently. When she'd finished, he nodded his thanks, then pulled a pair of gloves and a water bottle out of his own pouch and sprayed down Ani's tentacles. She made irritated noises and tried to squirm out of the way, but at last he finished, and gingerly, with a gloved hand, he examined one of her tentacles. It was slightly swollen, but nothing he'd worry about just yet, as long as it didn't get worse. He breathed a sigh of relief and turned back to Ree. Then he groaned. He was all too familiar with the expression on her face as she looked at him. She said something, and something about her tone, and told him that whatever it was, had he understood it, it would have made him unspeakably uncomfortable. Then she pointed at Ani, and, her expression still a little odd, said something at length, which he couldn't understand in the slightest. He shook his head helplessly, and she sighed again. She glanced around uncertainly, then got to her feet and peered out the spacecraft entrance. She gave a final, furtive glance around before she came to crouch back down beside Aran. She hesitated a moment, then reached into her pouch and pulled out a sheet of paper, unfolding it to reveal a roughly drawn picture of what must be the box that had come through the portal. Aran's heart began pounding quicker. She took another deep breath as if bracing herself, and he could practically feel the nervousness in her posture. At last, though, she bent over the paper, and Aran did the same. She pulled out a writing stick and, beside the box, made a quick sketch of a figure that was instantly recognizable as one of the Yibo. Aran frowned. Was he supposed to recognize someone? She shook her head in mild exasperation, grabbed the writing stick and scribbled out the figure, making a sharp gesture with her hand that he'd picked up meant no. His frown deepened. She sketched out another figure, something he couldn't recognize, a shape of some sort, a vehicle, a ship, and then, with a nervous shudder, she started another sketch. He leaned closer, eyes narrowed in concentration as he watched. A figure. A human, maybe? Certainly not a Yibo. It was taller than a human, though, from the scale of it. And then, over their heads, there was the soft hiss he recognized at once as one of the Yibo transport bikes. Ree made a small, frightened noise, and Aran cursed and scrambled to his feet. He reached for his own weapon, only to remember he didn't have anything but a bush knife. Well, and Ani, of course, but... He glanced down quickly at Ree. Her face had gone completely bloodless, and she was holding an incendiary to the paper. Before he could protest, it had gone up in smoke. She jumped to her feet and grabbed his wrist, and he resisted just long enough to snatch his gear and bundle Ani into the remains of his jacket, much to Ani's vocal displeasure. Then Ree was yanking him down the loading ramp and pulling him back through the jungle at a half-run, casting frequent glances over her shoulder. She didn't stop until they reached the force field around the biodome and slipped inside. Then she made a sharp gesture for him to stay in the corner, straightened her clothing, and with a visible effort to appear calm, she slipped back among the remainder of the scientists. One of them turned to question her, and she responded with a casual gesture in Aran's direction and a terse sentence in a tone that, even in the Yibo language, Aran recognized as exasperation. Aran sighed. The other scientist turned to glance at him, frowning, then twitched his tail in the Yibo equivalent of a shrug and turned back to the data collection. Ree didn't speak to him again, and after what had happened, he thought it best not to draw attention to himself. So he sat back, watching idly as his mind went over and over the events of the day. Ree's clear unease, the half-finished sketch, someone following them, the transport, the jungle-covered mounds outside. He still felt faintly sick. How many others from the dying diplomatic ship had landed on this planet and been killed before they could reach even the relative safety of the Yibo city? How many might the Yibo have killed themselves without a land devil to deter them? Maybe Istve was right. They knew next to nothing about their hosts, except for the most important thing. That Ree, at least, could possibly lead him to the cure for Istve. The only important thing, really. At last, as the sun was growing lower in the sky, the scientists gathered up their supplies, chattering back and forth to each other, and returned to their transports. Aran followed, and when they reached the transports, Ree shoved him onto hers, swung on in front, and made for the city, along with the others. He could still see the lingering fear in her face, the tight strain in her posture. Whatever it was she'd been about to tell him in the wrecked escape shuttle, she'd clearly found it almost as terrifying as the beast that had tried to eat Ani. And whoever had followed them, it clearly hadn't been entirely unexpected. Ree didn't speak on their drive. She turned off from the others to bring Aran back to the diplomatic quarters, and when she arrived, pulled to a stop and gestured curtly for him to dismount. The moment his feet touched the ground, she turned away as if to leave. "Wait," he called. With obvious reluctance, she turned back. Can we... He gestured to the transport, then pointed out towards the jungle. She made that sharp gesture with her hand. One of the interpreters had seen them and come over, and was waiting politely just out of earshot. Ree beckoned him over, and said something rapidly in her own language. The interpreter turned to Aran. "She says she won't be going out into the jungle again anytime soon, as she has the data she needed and she's very busy with her work." Ree was watching his face, and what she read on it when the interpreter stopped speaking was obviously sufficient. She gave a brusque nod and hit the throttle on the transport, not even glancing back at him over her shoulder. But he could still see that strange tension in her posture as she disappeared down the street. He stared after her, feeling suddenly hollow, his only lead so far gone. He took a deep breath and blew it out, feeling suddenly very, very tired. He thanked the interpreter politely, then turned and made his slow way back towards the diplomatic quarters. When he reached his room, Istvay wasn't waiting for him. Mystery's mercy. He dropped down on his bed, dumping out his sorely abused supplies on the light bedsheet. Then he cursed. Ani had climbed back up on his shoulders, which meant he'd left his damn jacket on the bike, which, considering how the day had gone, wasn't the worst thing that had happened, but still. As his fingers brushed through the mess, his eyes caught on a scrap of something mixed in with his supplies. It was a piece of fabric, the type they made on Colorida, not the thin, gossamer stuff they wore here. It had probably come from the abandoned escape shuttle. And he closed his eyes for a moment, feeling suddenly very cold. He didn't usually pay attention to what people wore, but this particular pattern had been imprinted on his brain while its owner stood over him, pulse pistol aimed at his face, as Aran lay frozen by an electric trank on the floor of a dying ship. Emmerich. Emmerich had survived the explosion somehow and had made it to the planet. Whether he'd gotten farther than the rotting mounds outside of the escape shuttle wasn't very likely, but the shuttle could easily carry over 100 people. And there hadn't been nearly that many mounds outside the shuttle door, which didn't necessarily mean anything, but damn it to hell. Istvay was going to be bloody furious. Chapter 13. Alba. Harach met her at the door of what she'd come to think of as the negotiations room the next morning. "Alba," he said, with his close-lipped smile, "I would like to propose a walk around the grounds. It pains me to think that you have not seen any of our beautiful city." Alba studied him for a moment, then glanced at Josip. He gave the briefest nod, and Alba forced her own lips into a close-lipped smile. "Of course. You are too kind. I would be delighted." "And of course, your aide is more than welcome to accompany us," he added. "My aides will be accompanying us as well." There was no change in his expression, but she could hear the hint of warning behind his words. She nodded stiffly, and Harach led the way out through the building. When they reached the broad courtyard outside, Harach led them around to a small inner courtyard, dotted with trees and lined with small paths that meandered through the greenery. There were a few moments as their party rearranged themselves to fit the walking paths, and when it was over, Alba, Harach, and Josip were walking side by side with the Yibo aides a short distance behind. The sun overhead was bright, the light dimmed slightly through the double layer of force field, but still enough that Alba found herself blinking at the brilliance. The shade of the trees was welcome, although it did little to modulate the sticky heat of the place, and sweat trickled between her shoulder blades and prickled her scalp. "I've heard from Kachik, and he is very interested in the progress of our discussion," said Harach quietly as they walked. The cheerful chirping of birds overhead and the soft humming of insects did much to disguise the sound of their voices, but even so, Harach had lowered his so that Alba had to strain to hear him. "We've hardly had time to open our negotiations," she replied, her voice almost as quiet as his. "I can make no promises yet as to what I can recommend to the council, but I feel we've begun working towards mutually satisfactory terms." Harach glanced quickly around. "This is a matter of some importance," he said. "I must have something absolutely firm to take back with me when I talk to Kachik. He will need to be persuaded that negotiations are the most beneficial way to approach this. And as I have told you before, I am more than happy to work towards a draft agreement that I can recommend to the council," said Alba. "But I simply do not have the authority to enter into a final agreement on behalf of my government without the council's full approval." "I am concerned what will happen if you do not." Harach's voice was barely a whisper. "I must operate within the constraints set me," replied Alba, her voice sharp. "And without the answers to certain questions, It will be difficult for me even to— Ambassador Herrock, Josip broke in with a friendly smile. I noticed this particular flower the other day, growing outside our quarters. It smells delightful, and I was wondering if you could tell me what it was. Herrock looked over, his face clearing in relief. Alba bit back both her irritation and her first instinct, which was to cut Josip off sharply. Josip was an experienced diplomatic aide, and, she found, she trusted him, more than she'd expected to, despite their earlier disagreement. It's a veerflower, Herrock said, his posture still wary. It's not native to the jungle here, so it has to be cultivated especially. It's beautiful, said Josip, beaming. Your gardeners must be talented. Well, we do like to ensure that those working here are skilled in their work, said Herrock, smiling slightly in return. I can tell, said Josip. I've been so impressed with how much care you've taken with us, ensuring we had food and accommodations that were suitable for us. We've felt like honored guests. And we would always be sure to treat you as such, said Herrock, his smile growing a little. As I've stated to Alba, I wish nothing more than peaceful relations. It must have been so much trouble, though, readying all the infrastructure that humans would need, said Josip, his tone sincere. I really don't know how you managed it in such a short time span. I am beyond impressed. It was nothing, Herrick waved a hand. Most of it was gathering dust anyways, and it hadn't been long enough for it to have fallen apart since last time. Alba had to bite back her quick intake of breath, but under Josip's kindly gaze, Herrock seemed not to have realized what he'd let slip. So, humans had been here recently then, at least within a few decades by the sound of it. There was more to this than ancient history. Well, trouble or no, I do appreciate it, Josip was saying, the corners of his eyes creased with that friendly, kind smile. Then he glanced over at the government building, which they were once again approaching. Oh, I am sorry. I apologize for the interruption. Although I would love to spend the afternoon quizzing you on the gardens, I'm afraid Ambassador Alba would remind me that's not what we're here for. Herrick nodded, his smile indulgent. It's no trouble at all. He turned back to Alba, and he dropped his tone lower again. I am sorry. As I was saying, I appreciate your position. But I also am operating within constraints. As I told you, there are those of us in the government who advocate for peace. But we must be able to demonstrate the strength of that position. Alba drew in a long breath. I believe, she said at last, that the terms we were speaking of yesterday will be broadly acceptable to my government, as long as I can give them certain promises in return. This afternoon, perhaps you and my aide and myself can find a set of terms acceptable to both our people and can have a draft document, at least, to present to your cacique. Herrock nodded, but Alba had spent enough time around the Yibo ambassador to see the worry in his posture. And I will pray that it is enough, he muttered. Madam, said Josip in a low voice as they walked back together later that evening, what they're proposing is not unacceptable, from what I can see, but— He shook his head, and she sighed. I know, she said quietly. She paused a moment, then cleared her throat awkwardly. Thanks to you, we know perhaps a little more than we did about their history with humans. At least, you managed to confirm this was fairly recent history, but I'm afraid it's not enough. I still have no idea why they would have been in contact with the Labyrinto system or what happened, and while Herrick at least seems to be nominally on our side, I don't dare trust him fully. We can present our draft document to Cacique tomorrow, but I cannot in good faith recommend a settlement to the council without more knowledge than we have. I know, madam, he said. I have been trying to find information for you as much as I can without arousing their suspicion, but what I've found has been contradictory. Herrick's slip today sounds like their contact with humans was recent, but other aides I've spoken with have mentioned that, as we originally guessed, speaking common dialect is something that's been passed down in certain Yibo families for generations. I don't know what to make of it. It could be two separate instances, but why? And why contact another human system now? but I don't dare push for fear of what the consequences might be." She glanced over sharply. His normally cheerful face was creased in a frown, and there was a weariness to his eyes that was almost startling. "Josip," she said at last, "I'm sorry, and I appreciate your help." She paused. "I shall talk with Inez tonight. If she's close enough on her translator program, it's possible that could assuage both my concern over the withheld information and your concern over the dangers of seeking that information." Josip nodded, a small, tired smile flickering across his face. "Thank you," he said softly. Their guide left them when they reached the door to the diplomatic quarters, and Alba slid it back, opening onto the large common room. Most of the survivors, it seemed, had avoided outright panic, but they were, for all intents and purposes, prisoners. Even if the Yibo would let them leave the compound, there was nowhere for them to go. They didn't speak the language or understand the culture, and outside the city walls was only a jungle that seemed both intent on and capable of murdering them. At the moment, the crew were clustered in small knots, talking quietly, arguing, playing some dice game or another they'd brought with them from the ship. Alba had no experience with this sort of thing. She'd been in government roles most of her life, which had always involved a calm, dispassionate, impersonally divvying out of resources or punishments, not interacting with the people for whom such resources or punishments were intended. But she'd overseen enough junior clerks in her time to know that idleness, boredom, and fear were a potent and poisonous combination, and a group of people easily swayed into a mob or a riot. Josip, though, smiled as one of the small groups of crew members turned at their entrance and called out their names cheerfully, as if he was genuinely delighted to see them, and, to Alba's small shock, they grinned back at him, their sullen looks lifting, and beckoned him over. He excused himself from Alba's side with a polite nod. "I'll come find you for dinner and we can talk further," he said, then made his way across the crowded floor to the group of people he'd greeted. Alba watched him go. There was an odd ache in her chest, for reasons she couldn't quite put a finger on. She'd never asked for friendship, she'd never wanted it, and she'd never sought it, but there was something about the comfortable, easy way Josip smiled at these ragged, uneducated crew members, and the way they smiled back, how they welcomed him into their conversations and their lives, not because they needed something from him, but because they simply enjoyed his company, that left the taste of something almost like regret in the back of her throat. But she wasn't their friend. She couldn't afford to be. What she was doing now was merely a weighing game, measuring the value of their lives against the dangers posed to the rest of Joias should the Yibo come through the portal. "Madam Chief Justice." She looked up, startled, to see Inez standing in front of her. The girl was smiling, her eyes bright with excitement, her dark hair framing her face. The sight of her like this was so unexpected that Alba blinked. "What is it, Inez?" The sharpness in Alba's tone was more instinct than on purpose, but the light in Inez's eyes dimmed, her posture drooping just a little. I'm sorry to bother you, Madam Chief Justice," she said. I wanted to tell you, I was working with the interpreters today, and I'm much closer than I thought I'd be to getting the translation program set up. Once I can run it, we can add a patch to our wavelengths that will allow instantaneous translation." Alba managed a small smile. It didn't have the warmth that Josip's would have, she knew, but at least she was trying. "Thank you," she said. "You've done very well. You should be proud of yourself." Inez stared at her for a moment, uncertain, then bobbed her head in a quick, nervous nod. "Thank you, Madam Chief Justice." She turned, but Alba said quickly, "Wait." The girl hesitated, then turned, shoulders hunched slightly, as if she was expecting a scolding. "How are you holding up?" Alba asked at last. She wasn't entirely sure why she asked it, except that Inez had looked so young in that moment, young and alone, and Alba had been the one to bring her here. Inez blinked in surprise and gave a small smile. "It's not that bad. No worse than when the civic guards brought me and the other village kids into Dusol for finishing school." Alba frowned slightly. When they brought you in for finishing school? But that was a benefit, surely. Inez's smile held a trace of bitterness. I guess it was. I mean, I'm sure the schools in Dusal are better than the ones in the Rim Mountains, but She'd been looking at the ground, and now she looked up. And for the first time, Alba caught the flash of something in her eyes. Anger or defensiveness or hurt, she couldn't quite tell. It's hard. To be taken from your parents when you're 12 years old. We couldn't see them because most of them didn't have the money to bring us back for holidays because you don't make that kind of money on the Rim. And they didn't keep the children from the villages together when they brought us in either, so none of us knew anyone. It was like this, but worse, because we were just kids. And my mom and my dad, I'm not sure they ever really got over it, losing their kids at 12. I was the oldest, but I had siblings. When I got older and I could earn my own money and come back, I saw the way my mom looked at them, like she knew she'd only have them for a little, like you see parents look at their child who has the defect. She paused a moment, staring at her feet. I'm sorry. Do you need me for anything else, madam? Alba shook her head silently. She stared after Inez, though, after she'd left, her eyes following the girl's slight figure through the crowded floor. There was a slight nausea roiling in her stomach. The reform had been one she'd wholeheartedly agreed to. The children from the Rim Mountain farms were almost always far behind their belt sector peers when it came to academics, and it limited their prospects. She'd been told that parents would often pull children from school with the excuse of illness, when instead they'd use them to help with planting or harvesting. Bringing the children into Dusal for schooling and mixing their cohorts between villages to give the children a taste of something beyond what they knew, keep them from an insular and myopic worldview, it had been for the best. For the children's own well-being. There had never been any rule that the children couldn't go home to see their parents. In fact, parents were encouraged to bring the children home over the holidays. And she tried to ignore the fact that in the debates, the possibility of parents being unable to do so had never come up. Anyway, it was the only way Inez had gotten to where she was, certainly. Had she done finishing school in the Rim Mountains, she'd never have made it into the University of Saint-Martin, no matter how intelligent she might have been. But, a small voice in the back of her head whispered, was, where Inez was now, really all that enviable? And, given the choice, was it where she would have wanted to end up? For a moment, she heard Istve's bitter words in her memory. You didn't even think to ask, did you? She turned away and started back to her chambers. It had been for the best. And perhaps it would take a few years for people to become accustomed to it. Inez must have been in one of the first cohorts, because despite her looks, she had to be at least in her early to mid-20s to have finished a graduate degree in linguistics, but once it was no longer a shock, it would catch on. And in the end, everyone on the council, even those who were originally from the Rim Mountains, had agreed that the reform was for the best. She tried not to recall the pain in Inez's face as the girl had turned away, the weary resignation in her eyes that belonged to someone much older than she was. Surely it had been for the best. Alba made the decisions because she was educated and intelligent and had earned her position and the public trust. She made them because she did know better than others what the Joias System needed. Just like she had been tasked with making the decisions in these negotiations, she had to know better. Because who was there to make the decisions otherwise? Chapter 14. Aran. Aran barely had time to put away his equipment before Istve banged on the door, then shoved their way in without waiting for an invitation. When they saw him, they grabbed his arm, pulling him to his feet. He fought back a flinch at the unexpected touch, and Istve let go like they'd been burned. "Where the hell have you been?" they hissed. Aran blinked and frowned. He hadn't realized until just now how strained Istve's face had become, how much those telltale dark circles under their eyes had darkened. He bit back the twist of guilt. He was trying to save Istve. That was the point of all this, and if he managed it, he could finally make those dark circles go away for good. And if he didn't... He gave a quick shake of his head. Those were thoughts he refused to contemplate. "I told you I was out in the jungle, collecting samples." And what samples exactly did you collect? Istvay's voice was icy, and they were staring pointedly at the raw burn on Iran's hand and at his torn shirt, where some of the acid from his and Ani's adventure had eaten through the fabric. Iran closed his hand self-consciously, trying not to wince at the pain of the newly blistered skin. We ran into a creature of some sort, and Ani decided that she wanted to pick a fight. It wasn't anything really, but honestly, I think there must be a topical anesthetic in the substance it secreted that we really should look into. I thought maybe there'd be enough left on my jacket that... He trailed off at Istvay's expression. Well, it's good to know you thought that was hardly anything, really, repeated Istvay, their voice brittle. Back here, things haven't been so simple. Apparently, the Yibo ambassador told Alba and Josip that the Yibo head of government, Kachik, will meet with her tomorrow. You know, the one we all suspect ordered the killing. And Inez has been working her butt off to get her translation program functional before then. And I've just been trying to keep everyone else here from being murdered by the Yibo. Well, except for you, since you decided to hare off into the jungle on your own with a Yibo scientist who you'd met exactly once before. I had Ani, Iran protested. Well, I bloody hope you found what you were looking for, so that maybe we might stand a chance of, I don't know, keeping you alive for a few more days. Iran paused, not wanting to continue the conversation, at least not with Istvay in this mood. While I was in the jungle, I found... Look, there was a crashed escape shuttle in the jungle. It was empty, and I didn't see any signs of anyone left alive, but it looked like Emmerich might have been on it. He caught the look on Istvay's face and hurried on. There wasn't any sign of him. He probably died in the jungle or in the crash or something, honestly. But I thought, Istvay sounded almost too upset to form words. You saw that? Out in the jungle, and you didn't even think to come find me to tell me about it? Just if it happened to come up in the conversation? What the hell, Iran? The tone in Istvay's voice was almost enough to make Iran flinch. He scowled. Listen, Istvay, I'm not stupid. This might surprise you, but I am capable of making some decisions on my own, and some of them might actually be good. I don't need a damn caretaker. There was a look of mingled shock and hurt on Istvay's face, and again the guilt rose up in Iran's chest, twisting together with his anger in thick, choking strands. But he ignored it. The two of them glared at each other for a moment, and something in Iran's chest ached. He wanted, so badly that it hurt, to see Istvay's familiar, crooked grin, the mischief dancing in their eyes, the way they smiled at him that made everything feel safe, like no matter what the two of them were going through, it would all be all right in the end. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen that look. Not since he'd agreed to come along on this damn mission, probably. When had this happened? He wasn't sure anymore what had gone wrong or how to fix it. Is everyone here all right? He asked at last, dropping his eyes. Istvay turned away, and just for a moment Iran caught a glimpse of the weariness in their face. No one's dead, if that's what you're asking, they said. We've decided to set a watch, just in case. I'm taking the first shift, and Josip and Inez will spell me off. I'll come with you, Iran blurted. It'll be better with two of us. Istvay just looked at him, and for one awful moment Iran wasn't sure what they'd say, but at last they gave a brusque nod. Fine, like you say, it's probably better with two pairs of eyes. Neither of them spoke as they sat in the dark on either side of the doorway. Iran wasn't unhappy with the silence. He wasn't sure what he'd say to Istvay if they wanted to talk. He wasn't sure what Istvay would say to him, and he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Over and over, his mind kept pulling up the sketch Ree had drawn out for him. The figure of a Yibo crossed out. Killed? Was there a threat he was unaware of in the box they'd sent? And then some sort of spacecraft. She'd seemed highly uncomfortable about it. Was the craft something to do with the reason behind the force field over the city? Did they think, perhaps, that the humans were coming through to attack them? It didn't really make sense. The Yibo may not have been friendly at their first meeting, but they'd never seemed particularly afraid of the humans. Well, unless Ani was there, and even then, Iran was pretty sure it wasn't the humans the Yibo were afraid of. Or was there something that had come through the portal before? He could still see, in his memory, those lines of data from the lab on the diplomatic ship, organic matter and inorganic matter mixed, remnants of destroyed spacecrafts. Was whatever Ree had been trying to warn him of the thing that had destroyed the ships in the first place? And what did that have to do with someone following them? Ree hadn't been nearly surprised enough for it to have been entirely unforeseen. There had been a reason she'd insisted they go so far into the jungle before she spoke to him. But who was behind it, and why? He hesitated, glancing at Istvay. But he couldn't talk to them, not when they were like this. He'd never seen Istvay thrown so far off their balance. He'd never seen Istvay so tense, so out of control. He'd never dreamed Istvay, of all people, would shout at him, and he knew, uncomfortably, that it was at least partially his fault. But the alternative, forgetting about the box, forgetting about the cure, was unthinkable. And mentioning to Istvay that he and the Yibo scientist had been followed while they were out in the jungle would not do anything good for Istvay's state of mind. He glanced at his friend again, out of the corner of his eye. In the dim illumination from the lights of the city outside, he could see the tight lines of Istvay's face, the strain in their muscles, the tension in their shoulders. Istvay was on the verge of breaking, and this might be the thing that would push them over the edge, and Iran wasn't about to do that. When Josip and Inez traded him and Istvay off, Iran and Istvay went back to their respective rooms, in silence. Iran fell into bed, his hand aching and throbbing where it had been burned, his entire body exhausted from the day's exertion. But tired as he was, he tossed and turned on the hard cot, unable to get comfortable. He must have fallen asleep at last, because when he opened his eyes again, faint light from the planet's sun illuminated his bedroom. He bit back a groan as he rolled stiffly out of bed, every muscle aching, and stumbled off to find the Yibo equivalent of a steam cleanser, a sort of hot shower that used much more water than a steam cleanser, but performed the same function. At last, clean and dressed and feeling slightly more awake, he made his way down to the breakfast room. He ate quickly, hardly noticing the food as he chewed and swallowed. Istvay wasn't there, but whether they'd woken early and already gone out or were still asleep, he didn't know. Again, that sharp pang of loneliness twisted in his chest, but he fought it down. If Istvay died, this was how it would be for the rest of his damn life. Ani, perched on his shoulder, gave a questioning chirrup. He managed a small smile and handed her a scrap of his meal as a treat, and she subsided contentedly. When breakfast was done, he made his way through the common room where the rest of the human refugees gathered, talking, arguing, and throwing dice, and out into the courtyard. Once, he was out in the morning air, already sticky warm despite the early hour. He glanced around quickly to make sure no one was watching, then slipped casually into a side street that led in the direction of the labs. He glanced behind him as he walked to check whether he was being followed, but it was impossible to tell. The Yibo gave him a wide berth, and whether someone was stepping quickly out of sight because they were trying to come after him, or because they were afraid of Ani, it wasn't easy to guess. There was an uncomfortable prickling between his shoulder blades at the memory of the man who'd been killed in these streets days earlier. Istvay would be furious that he was out here. Istvay would just have to damn well not know about it. Once he could see the towering shape of the science compound ahead of him, he turned to come around the back of the building. When he reached it, he checked the makeshift bandage around the still tender burn on his palm, and placed his hands carefully on the wall. There wasn't a force field around the building itself, Mystery's mercy, and it didn't seem to be heavily defended, although, considering the caliber of the guards' weapons, he wasn't sure it needed to be. It only took him a few minutes to scale the outside wall and drop silently down inside. He scanned the courtyard, then ducked behind the trunk of an arching tree as a small knot of Yibo scientists, talking loudly, came out through the walls of the building, the material dissolving and reforming around them. One day, he'd figure out how the hell they did that, but likely not today. He crouched where he was, studying the building's layout. If he remembered correctly, the lab was on the third floor, towards the back. It was impossible to see anything clearly through the strangely reflective glass, but he was pretty sure that in the corner over there had been a large storage closet. He closed his eyes for a moment. He hated heights. He bloody hated them. He reached into his supplies pouch and pulled out his adhesive grips. He'd used them more than once for scaling next to sheer surfaces. Technically speaking, they should work just as well on the Yibo buildings as they did on the rough rock faces he was used to. Better, even, but, well, he'd just have to not think about the butt for right now. Ani gave a comforting little chirrup and he pet her absently. She purred and touched his face delicately with the tip of one tentacle. The Yibo scientists were on one of the smooth walkways that crisscrossed the courtyard, partially obscured from view by the lacy branches of the trees. The moment they were out of sight, Aran started at a running half-crouch towards the corner of the building. When he reached it, he sucked in a quick breath of relief and glanced around. It didn't look like anyone had seen him, and the portions of the courtyard still in view were deserted. He fixed the adhesive grips to his hands and the toes of his boots and closed his eyes for a moment, fighting back the wave of panic. He was doing this to save Istvay. He opened his eyes and started up the wall. The grips gave just a little, like they always did, every time he shifted his weight onto one of them, and the sick, churning terror in his stomach spiked every damn time. 1 floor up. He'd have to hope that either the glass was thick enough that it would be difficult to make out from the inside, a damn idiot human scaling the walls of the damn science lab, or that the surface he was climbing faced onto somewhere out of the way enough that no one would think to look. 2 floors. His palms were damp with sweat, and he kept himself from looking down with an effort. If he looked, he'd panic, and Istvay wasn't here to talk him down. The thought of Istvay sparked another flare of panic, but this time it wasn't at the thought of what he'd see below him. He could do this. For Istvay, he could damn well do this. 3 floors. He stopped, wiping his face against the shoulder of his shirt, and glanced down just for a moment, on accident. He felt his entire body freeze. The ground looked 100 kilometers away, and he was acutely, absurdly aware of how little was actually holding him here, and how easily his grips could fail, sending him plunging to the courtyard below. Distantly, he felt Ani's tentacle suckers latching down on his shoulder, heard her small, questioning little noise. He forced his eyes closed, his whole body shaking. Istvay. He wasn't going to let his best friend die. Without opening his eyes, he carefully detached the grip from one hand and reached into his supplies pouch, pulling out a small, sharp cylinder designed for breaking the thick plex windows of a building or transport if you were somehow trapped inside. Still, with his eyes shut, he let his fingers slide across the smooth surface. It didn't matter if he was looking, he wouldn't be able to see inside anyways, so he'd just have to hope he'd guessed right, or else he'd send himself and Ani sprawling out onto the floor of the lab, which wouldn't exactly be the most subtle entrance. He held his breath and, with a sharp motion, hit the pointed tip of the tool against the glass. His fingers explored the small spiderweb of cracks, and he carefully felt his way to the center of them, positioned his glass pick, and tried again. After years of fieldwork in places that utterly terrified him, he'd become surprisingly good at working with his eyes closed. After 3 more strikes, the glass shattered with a delicate tinkle. He brushed his fingers across the long shards, gently enough to hopefully avoid slicing his finger open. That might be hard to explain to Istvay, and then cracked his eyes open a slit. There were no furious alien faces peering out through the hole he'd opened, so either he'd guessed right or no one was in the lab. But the soft murmur of voices from inside told him it wasn't entirely deserted, at least. He took a deep breath and peered through the hole he'd made. Sure enough, it looked like the inside of the supplies cupboard he'd seen the day before, and the equipment inside was clearly that of the lab. He pulled a protective sheet out of his pouch and shook it out carefully, then laid it over the sharp shards of glass and cautiously pulled himself through the opening he'd made, trying not to think of how far the ground was below him. Once inside, he glanced around the claustrophobic space. Damn it to hell, the Yibo didn't use doors in most of their buildings. He'd forgotten that detail. But there was a small gap in the semi-transparent surface, where the edge of one of the large centrifuge machines had been caught. The glass had only partially reformed around it. He knelt and peered through the gap. He'd guessed correctly. Outside was the lab he'd been brought to earlier, and he let out a quick breath of relief. Ree was there. From how frightened she'd acted the day before, he hadn't been sure she would be. She was working across the lab from him, her back to the cupboard. He glanced around irresolutely, then pulled a small water bottle out of his supplies pouch, the same one he'd used to spray off Ani's tentacles the previous day. It fit through the gap, just barely, and he rolled it across the floor. His aim was good, and it bumped up against Ree's ankle. She glanced down, half-turning, and frowned. Then, abruptly, she stilled, her body tense, her face taking on that same terrified expression he'd seen the previous day in the jungle. She glanced behind her, the movement quick and furtive, and he slipped his hand out through the small opening, just enough to be in view. She must have caught sight of it a moment later, because her body went even stiffer, her head jerking up as if she were being hunted. She hesitated, then said something to her lab partner and crossed quickly over to the cupboard. She stepped inside, pushing the centrifuge in with her so the gap in the glass closed fully, and turned to Aran. She was glaring, but there was stark fear behind her gaze. She whispered something harsh, then made a quick, angry gesture with her hand. "Listen," he whispered, even though he knew she couldn't understand. "I need to know more. My friend is dying, please." He reached into his supplies pouch and pulled out a drawing he'd made of the box. She snatched it from his fingers and tore it up, then tossed the bits of paper out the hole he'd made in the glass, to drift to the courtyard below. "Please," he said desperately. She made another curt gesture and turned, retrieving his jacket from one of the shelves. She turned back to him and held the jacket out, speaking quietly in her chattering language. He closed his eyes for a moment, despair sitting heavy in his chest. He opened them to the sharp poke of a finger in his chest. Ree was watching him with narrowed eyes, and when he met her gaze, she hissed something, then pulled out a small scalpel and sliced a quick cut across the pad of one of her fingers. Then she grabbed his jacket and squeezed the injured finger with her other hand, and a drop of red, glistening blood fell onto the worn leather. She pointed at it deliberately, then gestured to the lab. He frowned in puzzlement, and she made a gesture that, despite their lack of a common language, managed to convey absolute exasperation. Someone called something from outside, and she shoved Aran back against the shelves and turned, her hand parting the glass like a curtain. She called something in reply, then snatched a pipette from the shelf beside Aran's head and stepped back out into the lab. As she went, she managed to bump the centrifuge, and it lodged itself in the parted glass once more. Aran looked after her, still frowning. The space now was big enough, barely, that he could squeeze his way through if he had to. He glanced back at the glistening drop of red on his jacket and closed his eyes for a moment, his heart pounding. She was trying to tell him something, and he was pretty sure he knew how to figure out what it was. At last, the scientists began to filter out of the lab in ones and twos. Aran glanced at the sun through the broken glass. From the look of it, it was probably around the time the aliens took their midday meal, and with any luck, no one would look up and notice the damn hole broken through the side of their lab building 3 floors up. Ree left with the final group, but she cast a quick, nervous glance behind her as she went. Aran waited until they were all gone, then a couple minutes more to be safe, and then, gingerly, he slid out from his hiding place and into the lab proper. The equipment here was unfamiliar and the readouts like nothing he'd seen before, but if he recalled correctly from his earlier tour of the lab, yes. There, the DNA extractor. He dropped his coat on the lab table and pulled a swab from his supplies pouch. He held it against the red stain, and as the blood soaked into the white fibers, he inspected the machine quickly. Istve would be better at this than he was, because Istve was the one that paid attention to systems and procedures. But Aran had spent enough time around lab equipment, familiar and unfamiliar, that he could make an informed guess as to what he needed to do. He tapped the power on and fed the swab into the mouth of the machine and waited as it hummed quietly to itself. He glanced around the small lab as he waited for the analysis to finish. DNA sequencing was a time-consuming process back on Colorida, But if he'd guessed correctly, and he had to have guessed correctly, this was what Ree had been hinting to him about, which meant either she hadn't thought it all the way through, or the Yibo's DNA sequencing procedure was faster than the ones back home. Or she wanted him to get caught and was setting him up. Still, there were 100 easier ways she could have set him up if that's what she'd wanted. At last, the DNA sequencing machine beeped, and after a few unsuccessful tries, Aran managed to pull up the screen with the readout. He scanned through it blankly. It was utterly unintelligible. He groaned in frustration and glanced around again, helplessly. How long did he have before the scientists came back? Then he frowned, and on impulse pulled out another small sample, a bit of what had come through the portal. He paused a moment, then fed it into the machine. He already had a DNA analysis of the sample from back on Colorida. If he could run it through the Yibo machine, perhaps he could compare the two readouts and come up with a key. The DNA sequencer beeped a few endless minutes later, and he captured the data on his palm screen. He shut off the machine and paged back to the previous readout. He frowned, comparing the two images. Then he scanned back to the readout of Ree's blood, his heart pounding. For a moment, he felt like someone had hit him in the stomach, hard enough to knock the breath out of him. He'd need a lot longer to figure out a key for interpreting the scans, or to extrapolate any of the data. But one thing was all too obvious. Whoever or whatever had provided the blood sample that had been sent to Colorida was an entirely different species from the Yibo. He stood staring at the DNA readout for a long moment. His brain was whirling too quickly to allow him to focus on any one thought. An entirely different species. No wonder Ines was struggling so hard to figure out the language. If he was right, she was trying to interpret a completely different language than the one she'd worked on from the portal samples. And if it hadn't been the Yibo who'd sent the box, had it been them who'd opened the portal at all? Or for that matter, who'd closed it? He leaned against the table, trying to gather his thoughts. Ree's brief sketch in the jungle. This was what she'd been trying to tell him all along. The box hadn't come from the Yibo at all. It had come from someone, or something else. Ships, the force field over the city, her instinctive fear of something coming from above them. How everything about the box made her nervous. The sharp ting of something hitting the floor in the hallway outside caught his attention. He frowned, looking up, and then he realized he'd been hearing in the back of his brain the sound of approaching footsteps, the chatter of voices. He recognized Ree's voice, loud and nervous sounding, and he could see faintly through the glass a figure bending over, as if retrieving something from the ground. He swore and jumped for the supplies cupboard. Damn it to hell. The glass parted as a group of scientists stepped into the lab, and he saw from his hiding place the tension in Ree's posture, the way her eyes darted around the lab, and then how her posture relaxed on finding it empty. And then one of the scientists started for the supplies cupboard. Aran swore under his breath, scooping his supplies and data haphazardly into his supplies pouch. Ani growled uneasily, tightening her tentacle suckers down on his shoulder. "No, Ani," he hissed. Right before he had to climb 3 stories down the sheer side of a building was not a good time to be knocked dizzy by land devil venom. The scientist had almost reached the cupboard. Ree called out, and through the small gap in the glass he could see the approaching scientist pause, half turning to call something back. Then he turned back, reaching out his hand to part the glass. Aran hissed in a quick breath, slipped the grips back onto his hands, no time to pull them over his boots as well this time, and, sending up a prayer to the great mystery, slipped out the broken hole he'd made, pulling the protective sheet after him. He could hear the moment the scientist stepped into the supplies cupboard. There was the crunch of glass underfoot, a moment of startled silence, and then a shout of alarm. Damn it to hell, damn it, damn it, damn it! He squeezed his eyes open for a moment, glancing down to judge the distance. Too far to drop, that was for damn sure, at least if he didn't want to break both his legs in the process. But someone would poke their head out any minute now. He was dangling over the height from the grips on his hands like a fly dangling from a damn spider's web. He gritted his teeth and sucked in a breath and started lowering himself hand over hand, trying not to think of the distance between him and the very hard ground. very far below. His shoulders ached and burned, the muscles in his arms shaking with the effort. The grips were never meant to hold his body weight singly. It was supposed to be 3-point contact, so no one link would have to hold the climber's full weight. Now, every time he pulled a hand free to lower himself, the remaining grip slipped, ominously. From above him, he could still hear the Yibo scientist's sharp tones, and he could see through the glass a vague shape approaching the broken hole. He was halfway down by now, at least, he was pretty sure, far enough that a fall wouldn't necessarily kill him. He held his breath and, with a sharp yank, pulled both his grips free from the glass, shoving himself off the wall at the same time. The sharp, panicking sensation of falling hit him like a wave, and he gritted his teeth, bracing himself, and then he hit the ground hard and rolled, Ani hissing in disapproval. A sharp pain shot up his ankle, but he scrambled to his feet and dived behind one of the trees, as a Yibo head poked through the shattered hole in the wall of the building. The moment no one was looking, he sprinted silently for the courtyard wall and, with arms almost too shaky to obey him, pulled himself up and over, landing with a wince on the street below. Pain jabbed through his ankle with each step as he made his hurried way back through the streets, but his mind was spinning so fast he hardly noticed. He slipped back into the courtyard of the diplomatic quarters and through the mostly empty common room. At this time of day, most of the other humans were in their rooms, sleeping away the worst of the heat. Istvay was pacing restlessly back and forth in front of the door to Aran's room. When they saw him, they grabbed him by the shoulders. "Aran! I've been worried sick about you. Where the hell did you disappear to?" And they stepped back a pace, frowning. "And what happened to you?" Aran managed a tired smile. His whole body was still buzzing with adrenaline, leaving a sick knot in his stomach. "Pishti, listen, I just got back from the lab. The scientist I went out into the jungle with gave me a drop of blood for a DNA analysis, and..." He squeezed his palm screen, holding it out so Istvay could see the parallel sheets of data. "Their analysis readout is different than ours, obviously, but this is the readout from the blood sample that came through the portal, and on the other side is the scientist's blood." Istvay frowned at the readout for a long time. When at last they looked up, Aran could see the comprehension on their face. They're not the same species. Aran nodded again, distantly. For a few moments, he and Istvay stared at each other. Then Istvay reached out, supporting themselves on the wall. Their face had gone very pale. "What does this mean?" they asked quietly. Aran shook his head. "I have no idea, but..." He paused and met Istvay's gaze. "I'm going to find out." Istvay closed their eyes, and there was a pain in their expression that made Aran look quickly away. "Aran," they said at last, quietly, "while you've been gone, they're not good. The Yibo guards have been here 3 times looking for you. I don't know what they're after, but if I was going to guess, I'd say they don't like the idea of someone with the kind of firepower Ani gives you wandering around free. You know how nervous they are when she's around. We need to get out of here while we can. I'm afraid Alba's gotten herself in deeper than she realizes. If we can get out, there's a chance we can come back later and help the others. But if we're caught here..." Aran stared at them. "Pishti, no, I told you. I need more information before..." "Aran!" They made a quick, brusque gesture. "I'm not joking. You've got Ani. So right now if we try to leave, I doubt they'll be able to stop us. They're too afraid, but..." They glanced up and swore. "They're coming back. Aran..." Aran glanced up, his heart pounding strangely. A small group of frightened-looking guards, accompanied by an interpreter, were approaching. "Hello, Aran!" the interpreter called as they approached. There was a tinge of nervousness in her voice. "Hello?" he said warily, turning to face them. Istvay stood beside him, their entire body tense. The interpreter cleared her throat. "Aran, I have been asked to inform you that Kachik has requested that a separate quarters be prepared for you and your pet. And your assistant, of course. They are welcome to accompany you." She made a nervous humming sound. "I do hope you don't take offense, but your animal has made some of the government ministers nervous. This way, we can keep her from disrupting their schedules, while providing you pleasant accommodations without the constant attention, which must be uncomfortable." Aran watched her for a moment. Istve was right. They were trying to neutralize the threat he posed, put him somewhere that Ani would no longer be part of the equation. What little influence he had at the moment would be gone completely. And Istve was right about something else, too. If they ran now, he and Istve and Ani could still get out. He could see it in the guards' postures. They wouldn't come after him, not as long as Ani was with him. They'd be free. And he'd be back, where he'd been, on Colorida, desperately searching for a cure that might exist, but with no idea where to find it. And that he couldn't do. He couldn't bear to. He took a deep breath and gave the interpreter a close-lipped smile. "Thank you," he said. "I'll follow you." She turned, her shoulders slumping in relief, and the guards closed in around the two of them as Aran turned after her. He deliberately avoided Istve's gaze, but he could feel the fury rising off them like steam as they fell into step beside him. Chapter 15. Savina. Savina crouched in the dark of the alley, her knife at the throat of a trembling Yibo woman. "You're told me to kill you, just like I killed your co-workers," Savina whispered. "But I'm a merciful person. I'm willing to look the other way when you escape, but only if you tell me what I need to know." The Yibo's eyes were wide with terror, but she didn't tip her head in acknowledgement. The electric trank on her stomach assured she wouldn't move a single muscle until Savina let her. "Now," said Savina, lifting the knife from the woman's throat. "I'm going to take this off. You'll be able to move again, but you're going to be very, very quiet. Because if my little Yibo helpers figure out you're here and that you're not dead, they'll make sure to rectify that. But they won't need to, because by the time they get here," she smiled, "you will be dead." She knocked the electric trank free, and the Yibo jerked, her body shuddering. "Now," said Savina, "I asked around before I started on this job. I know you speak my language. That's why you're not dead on the street with the others. So let's see if you can stay that way. Tell me, what are the Kari?" The Yibo's eyes were wide with shock and terror. She paused as if gathering her thoughts. "The Kari. Raiders, in your language. They hunt us. They're the reason we put up force fields around the cities." "Are they sapient?" The Yibo shivered. "Yes, they're very intelligent. Most speak our language and yours, as well as their own." Savina smiled. "Perfect. And how would one contact them?" This time, the Yibo woman just stared at her. "I said," Savina hissed, raising her knife again, "how can I contact them? Because I know people do. I know people make bargains with them." She pushed the knife up against the Yibo's throat, and red welled up around the blade. "I know your boss has made bargains with them." "I'll tell you. Please," the Yibo rasped. Savina let off the pressure with a close-lipped smile. "Good. I'm so happy you're cooperative." The Yibo woman swallowed hard and closed her eyes for a moment. "There are communication devices you can use to contact them," she said at last. "They have an open channel. They can't get into the cities, normally, and we have defenses outside the cities, weapons and so forth. They don't raid around major settlements like this, at least, not often. But there's a communications line open for bargaining. The lawmakers and the law enforcement pretend they don't know about it, but they use it too if they have to." "Savina, did you find her?" Rach growled from around the side of the alley. "Give me the communicator, now. I know you have it. You're your boss's communications specialist." Savina grinned. "Or you were until tonight. Hard to be a communications specialist for someone who's dead." "Savina?" "Now!" Savina hissed. "You don't understand what these raiders are," the woman whispered. "You don't know what you're—" Savina raised her knife, and the Yibo woman yanked out a small device, shoving it into Savina's hands. Savina grabbed it, tucking it into her bra for safekeeping. "Get out," she hissed. But if I find you lied to me, I'll track you down, and believe me, I will make you hurt in ways you've never imagined." The Yibo woman tipped her head in a quick, desperate gesture, then scrambled to her feet and took off down the alley. "I found her, but she got away," Savina called back. "I got a knife into her, though. I doubt she'll live long. Not worth going after, I think." Rach rounded the corner, his weapon drawn, and pointed at Savina. "You don't think?" he hissed. "Who gave you the right to make decisions?" Savina took a deep breath and turned, pasting on a look of distress. It was easier than it should have been. The sight of blood running down Joska's throat, the memory of Reka's cold, disdainful gaze as she yanked the knife from her bloody arm and tossed it to the cobblestones, haunted Savina's memories and twisted uneasily through her dreams. None of them were safe here. None of them would be, until she fixed this. I'm really sorry. I honestly thought I'd be fast enough to catch her, but she has one of my knives in her back right here." She touched a spot just below her shoulder blade. It went in deep, I saw it, and she was coughing blood by the time she got around the corner. "I don't think she'll make it far." Rach snapped something at two of the Yibo, and they started down the alley in the direction Savina had pointed. The wrong direction, and by the time they figured it out, the Yibo woman should be long gone. Yor had grown accustomed to granting Benny access to her internal files in order to plan the raids, and even if you didn't know the language, it was surprising how much you could pick up from context. This Yibo woman, for as pathetic as she looked under Savina's knife, was a killer, and good at it. She'd be fine. "All right, human, you've done your part. Come on, let's get back," Rach growled. "Yor wasn't thrilled you suggested this raid, but she'll be happy enough now it's paid off." Savina dipped her head humbly and followed, the communication device cold and hard against her skin. It had paid off indeed. "Vina, are you all right?" asked Benny, as soon as the door to their room closed behind her. Savina glanced around quickly. Joska and Nicolau weren't there, probably out doing some errand for Yor, so it was just Benny and Rafael waiting for her. Savina took a deep breath. "I'm fine. Listen, Benny, I need you to help me with something." She paused a moment. "Nicolau and Joska are they?" "They're fine," said Benny. "They're downstairs washing up dishes. Rafael and I just got done." They paused. Is Reka after Joska now, too?" "No." Savina bit off the word. "Joska was in the wrong place at the wrong time." She glanced over to where Raffel sat in the corner, but he seemed to be absorbed in whatever the hell he was doing. She reached into the front of her tunic and pulled out the communicator device the Yibo woman had handed her. "Benny, I need you to take a look at this, see if you can figure it out. It's supposed to be able to connect to some open channel, but I don't know anything about the communication channels the Yibo use." "I know a little," said Benny, frowning, their fingers brushing over the device. "I've been able to pick up some things while I've been planning the hits. What is this for?" Savina hesitated. "It could help us get out of here," she said, lowering her voice. Benny was quiet for a moment, still running their fingers absently over the device. "I'll see what I can do," they said at last. Savina looked at them more closely, frowning. There were dark circles under their eyes, and they looked exhausted. "Benny, have you been sleeping?" she asked abruptly. Benny's cheeks flushed darker. I've just been..." "Have you been listening to those stupid romance novels all night?" Savina snapped. Benny looked down and didn't answer. Savina gritted her teeth. The last time Benny had been like this had been after a particularly messy job, and it had taken Savina weeks to pull her sibling out of it. And Savina wouldn't ever admit it, but the sight of Benny growing more and more exhausted, their face drawn, the bones in their wrists more pronounced, terrified her. It scared her more than anything had scared her since she was 12 years old and she'd saved her brother, and burned 5 people alive to do it. "I'm fine, Savina," said Benny softly. They couldn't see Savina's expression, but Benny and Savina had been a team for so long that Benny didn't need to. "I'm just..." They trailed off, as if unsure how to finish the sentence. "You're damn well going to start sleeping, or I'll make you take sleeping pills again," Savina gritted out through her teeth. Benny nodded, turning away quickly. "I'm going out. they said shortly, and left, closing the door behind them. Savina stared at the door for a few moments, her hands clenched into fists. This was spiraling out of control. She swore viciously and turned around. Raphael stood against the wall, his arms crossed, watching her. When she caught his gaze, he sighed and straightened. She narrowed her eyes at him, making no secret of the fact she was not in the mood for conversation. He paid no attention, because of course he didn't. "Savina," he said bluntly. She glared at him and didn't answer. "I don't think I've been subtle about the fact I don't like you," he said. She snorted. "I'm not sure you could have been more obvious if you'd written it on a sign. Don't worry, the feeling is mutual." His mouth twitched in a reluctant half-smile, but the expression disappeared almost as soon as it came. He sighed again. "Your brother seems like a decent person, and even Benny's not a complete monster, so because of that, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. I'm going to assume you have the capacity for rational thought." He stepped closer to her. He was taller than she was, and his prosthetic leg gave him an odd, swaying limp. "I'm going to assume that somewhere in that black heart of yours, you have the capacity to recognize when someone's done you a good turn, so I'm going to tell you something about Joska." Savina stared at him for a moment. Raphael snorted at her expression. "What? You think I'm about to tell you she's an undercover assassin like you, or that we're secretly lovers?" He shook his head. "Nothing like that, but she's a good person." He hesitated, a distant look in his eyes. "I served in the military before. I was one of those that got sent out to put down the uprising in the Rim Mountains 10 years back." He shuddered, just a little. "Don't like to think about it too much. But that's where I lost my leg." He paused. "I was in a bad way after that," he said at last, quietly. "Nightmares every night. Hated the whole system. Couldn't go back to the military, not like this." He gestured at his prosthetic leg. "Didn't have the skills for anything else either. They pay you if you get injured on duty, but it's just enough for a tiny apartment and a few cheap bottles of wine in the evenings. And they don't tell you how you go off your head crazy sitting around replaying it over and over. Finally started taking on jobs on cargo transports. But never stayed long. No one wanted me. Don't blame them either. I was a nasty bastard. Figured anyone who took me on did it out of pity, and I hated them for it. Got thrown off a few crews for fighting. Then one day they were hauling me into the station brig to sober up, and I met Joska. She asked me if I wanted a new job because she was looking for crew. I almost spat in her face, but I couldn't bring myself to. Figured it'd be another temporary post, but..." He shrugged, his gaze still distant. "It wasn't. I figured out, eventually, she wasn't much different than I was, far as her situation. Worked her whole damn life just trying to get ahead, but every time she almost got there, something slapped her down. Maybe if she'd been a little more ruthless, she would have made it, but it never seemed to matter to her all that much, at least I never heard her complain. Even after that storm broke up her ship 5 years back and she lost every damn bit she'd been saving, oh, she swore the air blew when it happened. But even then, never really heard her complain. Just kept going, when I figure anyone else would have given up. And she'd have been in her rights too, I figure. She was just barely starting to get her feet under her again when you..." He made a brief motion with his hand, but Savina understood very well what he was saying. She hated how the guilt gnawed at her insides at the thought. "She saved my damn life," he said quietly, not taking his eyes off her. "I wouldn't have lasted more than another year or two. And I know you're not stupid enough to think she hasn't saved yours." "It was just the easiest way to make sure she got her ship back," Savina snapped. Ruffles snorted. "Even you aren't that damn stupid." Savina glared at him, trying to ignore the guilt curdling in her stomach. His eyes caught Savina's. There was an unaccustomed gravity to his expression. "She's my friend, and she's saved my life. More than once, and you will not hurt her, any more than you already have. I know if I went up against you, I'd be dead in 2 seconds flat. But I'll do it, Savina, if that's what it takes to keep the captain safe. Do you understand me?" His meaty hands were balled into their fists, but he didn't look frightening. Just resolute and maybe a little scared. Savina narrowed her eyes and licked her lips. She wanted to snap a sharp retort, but she couldn't seem to bring herself to. "You say she's so good," she said finally in a low voice. "You felt like a victim because of what you did to a bunch of farmers and kids in the Rim Mountains. And you think Joska's some hero for taking you on in spite of that. You say she's been so benevolent, saving my life when she didn't have to. I could have killed her 100 times, and I haven't. Am I a hero too? She took you on because you were Orthodox and military and had a sad backstory. She's kind to me because I'm Orthodox and I'm young and pretty and I remind her of her niece. How do you think she'd treat me if I was ugly? If I was weak? If I was an old believer?" Her heart was pounding because Rafael hated her and that was fine. She hated him too, and he'd have no reason to soften the truth. Rafael was staring at her. At last he snorted loudly. "After everything you've seen? And you think any of that would make a difference?" His voice was almost scornful. "I'm so young and pretty with my leg and my attitude, and that's why she took pity on me? Pretty sure the captain didn't ask how you prayed before she saved your sorry butt from the government agent." He turned away in disgust. "You're stupider than I thought, but I'm warning you, I wasn't joking." "Listen," Savina spat. "Like I said, I could have killed Joska 100 times over, and I haven't. I still bloody well need her to get me off this dump of a place, so you don't have to worry about me not taking care of your hero. I have a vested interest in making sure she stays alive, and you know I look out for my own interests." Rafael turned back and gave her an appraising look. Then, finally, he smiled, so briefly she wasn't sure she'd actually seen it. "I'm not like Joska. I don't give a damn about you, or your reasons, or your history, or anything else. I just want to know that we're on the same side as far as the captain is concerned. And if we are, that's all I need." She stared at him for a moment as he turned away again. Then she shook her head, easy for him to say, as if he deserved any pity for what he'd done up in the Rim Mountains. Anyway, she'd been telling the truth. She couldn't kill Joska, not yet. And so the default was that she'd keep her alive. But nor could she trust her. Be careful of what hides under friendly smiles. That had been one of the precepts they'd pounded into her in the compound, the ones she'd repeated daily at worship her entire childhood. And unlike the ones about the great mysteries existing in a corporeal body, that one she actually believed. It was just a matter of waiting to see the threat under the smile. Benny came back right around the time the Yibo sent dinner in, something boiled and mashed and bland as usual. "Vina," Benny whispered when all of them were done eating. "I think I figured out how to make it work. Here, I'll show you." Savina led her sibling back to a corner as Rafael pulled out his pouch of dice. "Savina," Nicolau called, "you going to play? I'm with Rafael, but Joska needs a partner." "Benny can play in a minute," Savina called back. "I still have to work out some things for the next job." "This is how you turn it on," said Benny in a low voice. "And I think you just speak into it here. And then this button transmits the call. If a message comes back, you hit this button to listen." They paused. "As far as I can tell, this has got to be black market. The only reason they'd make something like this so low-tech is to avoid it getting tracked. Savina?" "You're just going to have to trust me, all right?" Savina hissed. Benny was quiet for a long moment. Then, at last, they nodded and stood, turning away from her. "Joska, you still need a partner." Savina could hear the laughter of the others in the background as she crouched over the communicator, typing out a message. The raiders, whoever they were, would understand her language. At least, that's what the Yibo woman had said. She'd just have to not think too hard about the reasons behind that. It wasn't until much, much later that night, when the others were already in bed, that the communicator buzzed in Savina's hand. She pulled it out and crossed over to the grimy window, holding the screen up to the moonlight. "We'll send someone to meet with you," the message read. 3 days' time. The tavern I've marked on the outskirts of the city, pay off your contact and he'll pay off the guards." Savina looked up, staring sightlessly out at the grimy alleyway, still and cold in the moonlight. She allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The raiders may be dangerous, but they had no idea who they were dealing with, and nor did Ur. And if everything went as planned, well, maybe Savina and the rest would survive this after all. Chapter 16. Alba. Madame. Josip's voice drifted through the door. It's me and Inez. May we come in? Alba glanced down at herself, as presentable as it was possible to be on this forsaken system, pushed herself to her feet, and hit the door control. Josip stepped inside, and after a moment's hesitation, Inez did as well. How are you feeling, madam? Josip asked. Despite the lines of exhaustion on his face, he was wearing his usual friendly smile. I'm fine, thank you, said Alba, and she realized the words had come out in a much softer tone than was her wont. The smile lines around Josip's eyes creased deeper. I'm glad to hear it. He paused a moment. Inez has some news for us. Began Inez, visibly bracing herself. I stayed up late working on the last of the translation program last night, and it's done. Alba stared. You've worked out how to translate Yibo? Inez nodded timidly. It's a program we can set into our wavelengths. I'll set it up for you if you want. Alba was still staring. At last she said, Inez, if you've done that... She shook her head. Thank you. You may have saved us all. Inez beamed. I'll install it on our wavelengths then, she said, with her usual puppy dog eagerness. It was only a short time later when Josip opened the door to 3 of the lower-ranking diplomats, plus an interpreter and a full complement of bodyguards. Alba? The interpreter said, ducking her head in respect. If you'd follow me, please. Kachik is awaiting you. Alba took a deep breath and followed. Their guides led them through the courtyard and into the diplomatic building. When they reached the room, the bodyguards pulled back the doors and gestured them inside. Alba hesitated, then stepped through, the 3 Yibo diplomats following behind. She was gestured to a seat, and Josip and Inez sat down beside her. The diplomats settled themselves on the other side of the room, and for a while, the 6 of them sat looking at each other. The Yibo didn't seem upset by the wait, but Alba could feel an itching impatience worrying at her. Inez's hand was clutched, white-knuckled around her icon, but Josip sat serenely. When he caught Alba's glance, he gave her a small, encouraging wink, and she sucked in a breath of disapproval that only made him smile wider. And then, at last, the doors behind them opened. The 3 Yibo diplomats jumped to their feet as someone who must be Kachik stepped through the door, flanked by his own bodyguards, and followed by Harach. The ambassador's head was down, but he managed a small, reassuring smile at Alba. Alba inclined her head graciously. Kachik returned the gesture with a close-lipped smile, but there was an unreadable expression in his large eyes. He walked to his seat slowly and sat down again with no trace of hurry. Ambassador Alba, he said, his accent making her name strange, I asked to speak with you because I have excellent news. Our scientists have been working day and night, and it appears they will very soon be able to restore the portal and restore you and your friends back to your own people. And in the interim, I understand that you and Harach have come to an agreement. I must congratulate you. Alba smiled, despite the tension twisting her stomach. I'm very glad to hear it. Of course, said Kachik. He paused a moment. I understand there have been some concerns on your part. Stemming, I gather, from various aspects of our culture you find difficult to explain. Alba stiffened. She began. Kachik shook his head. No, please. I apologize that this should have become an issue. I did not wish for it to distract from the negotiations. But as it seems you have reached an agreement... He flicked his tail in the Yibo equivalent of a shrug. I have instructed Harach that such matters are to be explained to you whenever you wish. Alba frowned, staring at him. Could it really be that simple? Thank you, she said at last. I appreciate your consideration. Of course, he said, smiling. We are delighted that our nations have met, despite the unfortunate circumstances, and that after all we were able to come to a negotiated agreement. As are we, said Alba, relaxing back in her seat just a little. She hadn't been aware how tense her muscles had been until now. Kachik smiled, then paused a moment. And just to be clear, this agreement you've made is binding on your government, yes? As the portal will soon be open, I would like to be certain of the state of things. A military alliance is something that must be dealt with properly, and I would hate for there to be misunderstandings. Alba frowned. Herrick hadn't mentioned a military alliance in particular, only an alliance in general. And while, with a generous interpretation, the draft document would likely invoke mutual military aid once details were worked out, it hadn't been something they'd discussed with any specificity. "I'm sorry for any misapprehension," she said, a sudden trickle of unease starting in the back of her mind. "As I explained to Herrick, I was sent here on behalf of my government to negotiate terms with you. However, I'm somewhat limited as to the scope and nature of my authority. Until I have the opportunity to present the agreement to the full council and receive their ratification, I'm afraid this document can be nothing more than a draft." Kachik's eyes narrowed slightly, and he made a brusque gesture with his hand. "That will not be enough. If we are to reopen the portal, we must ensure that your people do not intend to wage war on ours. The agreements we make must be binding beforehand to assuage any potential threat." He was speaking as if he feared a threat, but there was no fear in his posture, only a barely disguised impatience. "You've seen the weapons we carry," Alba said carefully. "They're hardly superior to your own technology." "But they are certainly not ineffective," said Kachik. "At the least, it would be proof of your goodwill. And, as you surely have surmised, that must be our main concern." Alba and Josip exchanged glances. She could see the echo of her own concern in Josip's eyes. "I can understand why you would ask for a binding agreement," Alba said slowly. "But as I have explained, my authority here is limited. As much as I might wish to, as an ambassador, I cannot bind my nation in an alliance with another without consulting the council." Kachik was studying her closely, and again she couldn't read his expression. He turned to his aides and said something in a low voice, and when the AI voice in Alba's wavelength spoke in her ear, she almost jumped. "They're lying," the cheerful AI voice translated. "This so-called ambassador is one of the most important people in their government. It's beyond the bounds of believability that she doesn't have the authority to enter into a binding agreement." Alba's veins turned to ice as she stared at Kachik, trying not to let her horror show on her face. She didn't need to glance behind her at Josip and Inez to know their expressions must have frozen as well. There was no way the Yibo should have known who she was. "She's delaying on purpose. Do you think anyone has spoken to them in secret?" Alba schooled her expression into its usual stern, no-nonsense look, forcing her face still. But if they could have heard her heartbeat, it would have given her away in an instant. "You would have me believe, then, that should you make an agreement with my people, your own government would refuse to acknowledge it?" Kachik turned back to Alba, a tone to his voice that was almost sly. Alba lifted her chin and narrowed her eyes. "I am afraid I would be outside the bounds of my authority to enter into such a contract. I could not require my government bind itself to such an agreement without due deliberation." Kachik nodded slowly, still watching her. "I see," he said. "You are telling me that under no circumstances are you willing to enter into an alliance with us." Alba took a deep breath. "I apologize if I gave that impression. That is not what I meant to convey. My government, as I have stated, has an abiding interest in entering into peaceful relations with you. They would not have sent me to head this diplomatic mission otherwise. I am merely speaking to the limits of my authority." She hesitated, then continued. "I may say, in fact, that there is not a single member of government who alone is authorized to make such a decision. All such decisions must be jointly made and must involve the majority vote of all three sections of government." They're hiding something, Kachik said to Herrick. I thought you told me you'd managed to get an agreement, and now they're holding back. Perhaps they're stronger than we thought, Herrick whispered back. There was nervousness in every line of his posture. After all, we didn't know anything about the Land Devil until they arrived. If their planet is populated with those beasts, and they've managed to harness them as weapons, this encounter could go very differently from the last. Kachik snorted. They're still playing coy. I hear from our scientists that scientist of theirs was trying to convince them that the thing was harmless. And if my intelligence from the peacekeepers is correct, there is a human who's escaped into the city who's proving how dangerous their low-tech weapons can be. Without land devils, I doubt they'd pose enough of a threat to seriously concern us, but we don't have the time to deal with a situation of that kind. Exactly, said Herrick eagerly. You must see how a negotiated solution— Kachik cut him off with a curt motion and turned back to Alba. He watched her for a long time. You must understand my position, he said at last, speaking in accented common dialect once more. You say you are operating under constraints. I am as well. And, as it appears, we are currently at an impasse. He made a brief gesture. I am a very busy person. I will allow you to go back to your quarters and rest. We can resume this conversation another time, perhaps when you've had some time to think things over. He gestured to the guards, and they stood, waiting for Alba and the others to rise. As they turned to go, he muttered something to his aides, turning away from them. If she won't commit to a military alliance, the AI voice in her ear translated, then we'll have to resort to the fallback. And if that doesn't work, it would take more resources than I'm comfortable with, but even taking those land devil creatures into account, I think we have the weaponry to force the humans to the table if we must, and if they refuse to negotiate even over the bodies of their people— He made a dismissive gesture. We destroy enough of their infrastructure that they can no longer communicate with the other generation ships and then move on to another settlement. We only need enough of them to keep our enemies' weapons busy. This is a temporary setback, nothing more. Alba forced her legs to keep moving. She was trembling, just a little, but she refused to let the Yibo see it. It appeared the situation was more desperate even than they'd imagined.